Chapter 215. The facade of the Shun Bank was very impressive. In the mortal world, this kind of business couldn't be low-key. It had to let people know at a glance that there was a strong financial and human support behind it. It had to make people feel fear and trepidation so that they wouldn't dare to default on their debts. It wasn't easy to do anything. A young man in a green robe and a small hat stood at the door with a kind smile on his face, as if every customer who came in was his father. Of course, there couldn't be a hired thug here. That was a last resort that couldn't be taken out casually to scare the customers. When he saw Lu Xiaoyi, he was the kind of person who was obsessed with cultivation. He was also the bank's favorite because this kind of person would sell everything he had for cultivation. He was just an ordinary person, so of course he didn't know the difference between qi refining and foundation establishment. Customer, you're here? May I know what you need? The small loan method is flexible, the limit is huge, and the mortgage method is simple. It's one of the best in Minzhou. May I know if the customer? The young man asked softly and respectfully as he led him inside. Can you make the decision? Lu Xiaoyi was indifferent. I can't, but my surname is Tian, so I can probably recommend a good deal for the customer. The young man hid a needle in silk floss. This was the cultivation of the younger generation of a big family. There were very few who hid in the back house and idled. Since Lu Xiaoyi knew that his surname was Tian, he probably knew some things about the family. He didn't beat around the bush and went straight to the point. I'm from Xinyuan. I'm an old friend of your Tian family. Who's in charge of the Tian family now? Call them here. I have something to say. When the young man heard this, his whole body trembled. He was a direct descendant of the Tian family, so he wasn't ignorant and inexperienced. Moreover, this Tian family's great ancestor was the biggest guarantee that the Tian family could deposit money here safely. So he didn't hide it from outsiders. He pointed at an old shopkeeper. Bring this guest to the guest hall. Oh no, bring him directly to the small guest hall in the back house. Take good care of him. He gave Lu Xiaoyi a deep bow. I'll personally go to the inner house to invite the family head. Please don't blame the Tian family for being slighted. The Tian family moved so quickly that before Lu Xiaoyi could drink his tea in the small living room, 3 old men had already rushed in. The head of the family was the head of the family, and there were 2 respected elders behind him. The 3 of them exchanged greetings with Lu Xiaoyi. Lu Xiaoyi didn't say anything unnecessary. He only wanted to quickly solve this problem and then return his freedom. He couldn't touch the affairs of the mortal world. Once he did, it would be endless. Therefore, he informed them that Gu Bei, who was also Tian Li Jun, had passed away at the end of his lifespan. Then, he personally took out everything from the legacy ring and laid them out on the table. In his opinion, the Tian family's dissatisfaction was inevitable. They were a foundation-building cultivator of a big sect with more than 200 years of savings. Now that they were spread out, they were actually so pitiful. No one would believe it. Lu Xiaoyi had already thought it through. As long as they showed any dissatisfaction, he would immediately leave without any discussion. However, what surprised him was that the 3 people in charge of the Tian family weren't surprised by their great ancestor's death. Moreover, they didn't mind the lack of belongings. They only had sorrowful expressions and tears flowed down their faces. After inspecting the belongings one by one and confirming that there were no mistakes, they carefully put them away. To Lu Xiaoyi's surprise, the head of the Tian family took out a storage ring and handed it over. Lu Xiaoyi didn't take it. He asked in surprise, "What's the meaning of this?" The head of the Tian family said in a sorrowful voice, Great ancestor Li Jun had long predicted what would happen after his death. He had been persuading us to give up the bank business and change to other businesses, thinking that it would be safe. However, we were ignorant and didn't know how to retreat in the face of adversity. The cost of maintaining such a large family was quite high, and we were reluctant to part with the business we were familiar with and the subordinates we were familiar with. We also hoped that our great ancestor would be blessed by the heavens and be able to take a step forward. Therefore, we couldn't make up our minds. Therefore, our great ancestor personally returned to the old house several years ago and handed me this storage ring. He warned me that if he ever returned one day, I could give this ring to the person who gave me his belongings. Our funeral matters are free to be arranged by this person. Master's arrival today is exactly what our great ancestor said. Therefore, I present this ring. I hope that Master can make the decision for the future of the Tian family." Lu Xiaoyi sighed in his heart. He was still too inexperienced. In front of an experienced cultivator like Gu Bei, he wasn't shrewd enough. He thought that the other party's funeral matters were unclear, but in fact, the other party had already arranged everything properly. Then, what was the reason for him to make this trip? He took the storage ring and scanned it with his divine sense. The items inside were clearly separated and neatly arranged. There were only a few items. A large pile of mid-grade spirit stones, about 3,000 of them. A bead of unknown use. 3 sword embryos, obviously top-grade goods. And a letter slip. He took out the letter slip and saw a line of words at the top. Gu Bei's last words. He scanned it with his divine sense again. After reading it, he couldn't help but sigh in his heart. The last words were written like this. Who is Master? Is he senior martial brother? Or junior martial brother? I don't know. But if I borrow from everyone I know and refuse to pay my debts, and there's still someone who's willing to take care of my funeral matters for me, then you're either a true friend or a saint. Please forgive me for using this method. In Xianyuan, this kind of matter should be very simple. 3 or 5 good friends gather, and there's no need to worry about anything. But the current Xianyuan is no longer the Xianyuan of the past. At least in my heart, it's not the same as the Xianyuan of history. This is also the lamentation of a few seniors and masters. There are fewer and fewer people like us who adhere to the style of the ancient swordsman. Although a mere foundation establishment cultivator claims to have the style of an ancient cultivator, it's somewhat laughable. We little cultivators don't have the qualifications to complain about the sex important matters. It's just that since it involves my background and I have so many debts, I deliberately set up this misleading formation just to find a more reliable senior martial brother or junior martial brother to take care of my funeral matters. The mortals of my clan are trapped by their own interests, and they've placed their hopes on me to take a step forward. Only when I leave will they lose their final hope. There's nothing I can do about it. Although the flying sword is sharp, it can't sever familial ties. But what can I do? I know I have no hope of reaching the upper realm. After more than 200 years of training, I only understood this point at the very end. I've worked hard for most of my life, wasted countless resources, and incurred countless debts. Why bother? Since Master is here, you should be a close friend. Gu Bei won't be polite. I have a few matters to entrust to you. Please don't find it troublesome. 3,000 spirit stones are the debts I owe, and the list is attached. Gu Bei has lived a life worthy of the heavens and the earth. But when I'm about to leave, you want to be a ghost who reneges on debts? Master, please repay them on my behalf, with my full name and integrity. After I leave, they'll also give up on the clan's matters. Please disperse the bank and find another path. There's no need to worry about their future. Although they can't bear to part with the bank's huge profits, it would be a lie to say they're completely unprepared. The future of the Tian clan has nothing to do with Master. The people of Gu Bei's Tian clan have only returned home a few times in more than 200 years, let alone Master. These sword embryos are my private stash. I'm kind-hearted, so I hid them. If you like them, then use them. Leaving them for the clan is a disaster. Finally, I have to talk about that bead. Master is willing to come here because he's not a greedy person. But to Gu Bei, he has to show something to be at ease. In my life, I've been ordinary. If we're talking about opportunities, this is the only one. This bead has no name, and its function is unclear. The only thing I can be sure of is that this is a spiritual bead, and it seems to be related to the flying sword. I've studied it for a lifetime, but my spiritual energy isn't enough, and I've gained nothing. Entering a treasure mountain for 100 years and starving to death. This is cultivation. Also, don't be addicted to it. Just treat it as a hobby in your spare time. Finally, let me guess. Are you an ancient boat? Or an ancient boat? Or senior brother Guhi? If you're right, on the anniversary of my death, please give me a cup of good wine. If you're wrong, I'm in the underworld F***** king, their grandpa. Chapter 216. You guessed wrong, Senior Brother Gubei. Looks like you can only live happily in the netherworld. Lu Xiaoyi suppressed the melancholy in his heart. At the very least, Gubei was still the perfect senior brother in his heart. Repaying the debt would have to wait until they returned to Xinyuan. The most important thing now was to clean up these Tian family members, which was also a troublesome matter. But he didn't think it was troublesome now. People were just that strange. I think you all understand Senior Brother's intentions. The business of the bank won't last long without support. What's more, you guys are secretly loaning spirit stones. If something happens, it'll be a big problem. With Senior Brother here, you'll have Xuanyuan's name to protect you. People will always have some scruples when doing things. But if you don't have this scruple, I won't stay here for long. What do you think? The three elders of the Tian family looked at each other helplessly. They couldn't bear to part with their business in Minzhou. They also didn't know if their family would decline if they switched to another business. But of course, they understood the great ancestors' intentions. They had lost their backing. If they didn't care about themselves, they might not only face decline, but collapse. Family head Tian said with difficulty, "We'll follow the great ancestors' wishes and close the bank business. But this loan business is complicated. There are all kinds of loose ends that need to be tidied up, accounts settled, transactions between banks, staff dismissed, and separation with Wushan sect. It's complicated and trivial. I'm afraid it'll take time." Lu Xiaoyi snorted. "You don't have much time. I can't be here with you all the time and be the backer of your tyrannical collection." The Tian family head was in an awkward position. That was indeed what he meant. Taking advantage of the fact that this great ancestor's fellow disciple was here, he wanted to take the opportunity to make some more money. At the very least, he had to minimize his losses. It was just like how he had just released a large sum of money. How could he get it back before the agreed date? Usually, he could take it slow, but now, Lu Xiaoyi warned, you can't enjoy all the benefits, but you can't collect all the debts. When doing business, you have to know when to advance and when to retreat. Why don't you write off some of the poor creditors? You won't lose much, and it'll leave a good reputation for the Tian family. It'll also be beneficial for the development of your other businesses. Don't tell me you're short of money. Senior Brother has left you with all his savings over the years. It's enough for you to eat and drink for several lifetimes. Why be so calculative? Especially those spirit stone loans of yours. They must be settled immediately and must not be collected. Otherwise, after I leave, what will you use to resist the endless harassment of those qi condensation cultivators? I've already said all the good and bad things. There's nothing I can do if you don't want to listen. But think about the future. You'll understand. Is it better to go all out now? It's better to leave them some leeway. Under Lu Xiaoyi's supervision, the entire Tian family started to get busy. It would be a lie to say that they were completely unprepared, because the great ancestor was faced with the problem of whether or not he would succeed in his breakthrough. He had actually made 2 backup plans. He had already found a backup plan long ago. In recent years, he had also been very restrained in lending money. These old fellows were crafty and cunning. They were more thoughtful than anyone else. Lu Xiaoyi didn't stay in the Tian family. Instead, he found a nearby inn. He set a deadline for himself. 1 month was the longest he could stay. There would always be things that didn't go according to plan. If it wasn't for Gubei, he wouldn't have bothered to care about how this family who had put out their money had changed their ways. But the truth was that it wasn't something that could be done just because you wanted to. There was no such thing as pure justice and evil in this world. 2 days later, he was studying the bead in the inn. Just as Gubei had said, this was a spiritual bead. Or to put it more bluntly, it was a spiritual power amplifier. Gubei's spiritual power wasn't enough to control it, but Lu Xiaoyi could do it. That was because his spiritual power was extraordinary. During the Foundation establishment period, the growth of a cultivator's abilities was mainly focused on their magic power cultivation. Although their spiritual power was also improving, the growth was slow. This was determined by the cultivator's sea of consciousness. Lu Xiaoyi was an old soul that had wandered the universe for countless years. Not to mention other things, his spiritual power capacity was fundamentally different from other cultivators. With the help of the star comparison technique, his spiritual power was increasing day by day. This was also his biggest trump card. It was the main reason why he dared to wander around alone before he had mastered his swordsmanship. But even so, his current spiritual power could only affect the spiritual power of other cultivators to a limited extent, and it was only for a short period of time. But if he used this bead together at a suitable time, he might be able to injure his opponent's spiritual power. As for what other functions this bead had, there wasn't enough time. He didn't have the chance to test them one by one. But obviously, he wouldn't be given enough time here. An employee of Deshun Private Bank rushed in hurriedly. Master, not good. A few cultivators have broken in and are trying to harm the main house. Master Wushan is blocking them, but I think 2 fists can't fight against 4 hands. I'm afraid he won't be able to hold on. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. He didn't want to come, but he just had to come. Minzhou City was a big city in the 5th Ring region. There were hidden dragons and crouching tigers in the city. He didn't dare to release his spiritual sense casually. So even though he was very close to the Shun, he still didn't know what was going on. Master Wang was a foundation establishment cultivator that Wu Shan had sent to Minzhou. Although his backer was the powerful Xianyuan swordsman, distant water couldn't quench the thirst at hand. He had to find a decent backer in the local area. Not every bank could do this. The reason why Master Wang liked the Shun was actually because of Xianyuan. It was complicated and hard to explain in a few words. He followed the clerk to the Shun Bank. He wasn't in a hurry. Cultivators wouldn't attack in crowded places in the city, and they wouldn't fight between cultivators here. This was also a rule, especially when it came to foundation establishment cultivators. If they couldn't control it carefully, it was easy to cause harm to innocent people. This time, they were in the VIP lounge of the Shun Bank. The room was large, and there were many people. There were over a dozen bank managers, including the 3 old Tian family fellows. They were all shouting themselves hoarse as they tried to explain something. A Taoist with hidden anger was confronting the 3 cultivators. It was Wushan Sek's Taoist Wang. This bank was under his protection, and he had obtained a great deal of benefits from it. He wouldn't shrink back. Since others had come looking for them, it was the same as slapping them in the face. Where could they hide? Every year, they took away a great deal of resources from the bank so that they could do this. Moreover, this was Wushan Sek's territory. There was no need to be afraid. The 3 cultivators had their backs to the door. From their clothes, it was impossible to tell which sect they were from. There was also someone Lu Xiaoyi recognized. It was the victim Huang Goshing, but he was clearly here as a witness. In the face of the Tian family's anger, he could only grit his teeth and endure. Once he reported this, he could only win. He couldn't lose. According to the rules of the cultivation world, if a mortal bank deals in spirit stones, they will be severely punished. They will have to sell off their assets and go bankrupt. As for the person behind them, they could be handed over to the sect to deal with. Fellow Taoist Wang, could it be that Minzhou province isn't above the 5th ring and isn't bound by the 5th ring? I don't believe that once today's matters reach your sect's ears, you will still be free and unfettered. Chapter 217. It wasn't a secret that mortal world banks were involved in the circulation of spirit stones in the 5 rings. If the water was too clear, there would be no fish. Where there were benefits, how could they completely eliminate them? Although the influence of a sect was great, it was impossible for them to take care of every aspect of the mortal world. But humanity's heart towards the Tao was never left out. If there was a need, there would be a transaction. This was something that everyone tacitly understood. Generally speaking, as long as one didn't go too far, and as long as one had to support a local sect, there wouldn't be any major problems. As for someone like Taoist Wang, not all of his income went into his own pocket, but most of it was given to his sect as a form of filial piety. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to obtain such a lucrative city. But what one feared was meddling in other people's business. This was especially true for those cultivators who had just started their cultivation and didn't care about the sand in their eyes. They had a strong sense of justice and traveled the world, making friends and fighting for justice. Only when they grew older and thoroughly understood the cruelty of cultivation and began to place most of their attention on their own future would they not recklessly meddle in these trivial matters. Meddling wouldn't be thorough, so why bother? But that was only after a cultivator had fully matured. Before that, these people were the most hated elements of the Five Rings continent. But the style of the Five Rings was that they didn't stop such practices. Rather, they believed that these were the signs of low-level cultivators being active. Fighting was healthier. Of all the elements of the Five Rings, the ones they hated the most were the disciples of large sections. In other words, the disciples of sects that had influence throughout the entire world were the disciples of these sections. They placed the order of the Five Rings on their shoulders, and weren't they afraid of breaking their own shoulders? Comparatively speaking, the ability of disciples of local sects to stir up trouble was much weaker. For example, Taoist Wang came from a local sect. If he went to the outside world, he definitely wouldn't stir up trouble. As for these three that came to uphold justice, they were definitely from large sects in the world. The Xinyuan that Lu Xiaoyi came from was also a large sect in the world. As he walked in, the Tian family patriarch immediately looked at him with a pitiful expression, no longer begging for mercy. He could see that although the shaman sect was usually arrogant, if something really happened, then the matters of the cultivation world really wouldn't be too effective. As he looked over, almost everyone looked over. This was a young man with a sword case on his back. His face was as bright as the sun, and he had a warm smile on his face. He gave off a good impression. Lu Xiaoyi pointed at Tian family head. All of you get out. Before we come to a conclusion, don't take any action. Just wait. Also, this person don't hurt him. He then pointed at Yellow Dog Leftover. You get out too. The Tian family members felt as if they had been pardoned from a death sentence and left in a single file. The remaining Yellow Dog was also dawdling. However, seeing that the three people behind him did not say a word, it had no choice but to leave. It wondered where this young cultivator came from, and how could he be so domineering? When there were only 5 people left in the hall, Lu Xiaoyi cupped his fists and said, Xinyuan cigarette, but how should I address you? This was the rule between cultivators. Out of politeness, one had to reply. If one did not reply, it would be contempt and they would be mortal enemies. This was not a place to act arrogant. Because of the sword on his back, Taoist Wang let out a long breath of relief. He had suffered a great deal here. Although he knew that the 3 of them wouldn't do anything to him, he didn't dare to do anything to them, because that would mean endless troubles. Unless he hid in the sect forever and never came out, there would definitely be Foundation establishment cultivators coming to find trouble with him. Prince Wushango, greetings fellow Taoist Xinyuan. Unsurpassed return, unsurpassed life, myriad scenes, flowing nether eyes. Lu Xiaoyi smiled. Since we all know each other's backgrounds, I won't waste any more words. Since we're all busy, let's cut the Gordian knot. Matters of cultivation should be resolved by cultivation. The bank loaning spirit stones is not an exception. Open an eye and close an eye. Let bygones be bygones. If you insist on being serious, then there is naturally a way to be serious. This bank is the foundation of my Xinyuan disciples. Fellow Taoist, Wang is only taking care of it on my behalf. It has nothing to do with him. The reason why the bank was closed and dissolved is because my senior apprentice brother passed away. Since he is no longer here, I naturally cannot take advantage of him. This is the rule. But if someone wants to use this as a pretext to make trouble and take advantage of this opportunity to embezzle, then I, Lu Xiaoyi, may have to continue operating this bank. Everyone should act with the dignity of cultivators in mind. The death of a person is the most important thing. I'm not going overboard by saying this, right? Lu Xiaoyi's words were almost directly revealing the essence of the matter. Undermining each other and making underhanded moves was fine, but had to be considered. For a clan like this that rose to prominence because of a cultivator, it was very shameless to make underhanded moves when the cultivator was no longer here. People would say, "Why didn't you come to make trouble when your roots were still here?" Why did you have to wait for the person to die before making a move on the person's mortal relatives? Everyone wanted to save face, so Lu Xiaoyi had the confidence to explain the matter clearly. These three people naturally knew what to do. Those who had just succeeded in their cultivation were the most prideful. They were unwilling to bear this bad reputation. As expected, once he explained the matter clearly, the leader, unsurpassed return, was stunned. Left? When did this happen? Which senior apprentice brother Xinyuan is it? Gu Bei. My lifespan ran out 3 years ago. I delayed some time and only just informed the clan now. Then, seeing that we are all cultivators and the path of cultivation is difficult, can you be magnanimous and let the Tian clan off? Lu Xiaoyi's principle in doing things was to make things clear. He must not hide things and create misunderstandings. He must be reasonable, lay out the facts, and then humble himself. If this still did not work, he would turn hostile and kill. But it was obvious that the three people, especially the leader, Taoist Rugi, were very reasonable. In fact, cultivators were rarely unreasonable, unless they did it on purpose. In that case, we came a little rashly. It's just that Lu Xiaoyi knew very well what he wanted to say. Since the Tian clan has chosen to let go, then the Spirit Stone loan from before naturally does not count. The person outside the door does not need to worry about this. Not only him, but everyone who has a Spirit Stone loan will no longer be pursued by the bank. Are the three of you satisfied with my arrangement? Of course, this wasn't a matter of satisfaction, but a matter of face. He had boasted in front of Yellow Dog and his friends, so he had to keep his promise. This was the reason why Lu Xiaoyi had all the mortals withdraw. Sometimes, with these mortals present, cultivators wouldn't be able to relax. In this deadlock, it was easy for things to go awry, heading toward a situation that no one wanted to see happen. But Lu Xiaoyi's words were very straightforward, so the three of them had nothing to say. They bowed and turned to leave. Taoist one was left behind, a little dazed. Senior apprentice Brother Gu is really leaving? The road of cultivation was extremely cruel. The older a foundation establishment cultivator was, the more they understood the bitterness of this road. They had known each other for 100 years. Now that Gu Bei had left, how much longer could he last? Chapter 218. Rugi's group of three left the bank and strolled around. Seeing that the two people beside him were not in high spirits, Rugi laughed. What? Are you not satisfied with how I handled things? This group of people came from the distant southeast region. They were actually visiting Wan Jinglu together with their teacher. After staying at Wan Jingliu's mountain gate for a few days, they felt extremely bored. Thus, under Ming Mu's guidance, they came out for a spin to relieve their boredom. Why did Ming Mu have to lead them? Not only because he was born in the West region and was a landlord, but also because Ming Mu and Ming Mu knew each other. They intentionally avoided the direction of the dome. After all, the possibility of encountering the swordsman in that direction was too high. But they did not expect to encounter the Xinyuan swordsman when they went against the dome. Ming Mu frowned. Senior brother, it's not that we question your decision, but we know this person. Rugi was surprised. You know him? How long have you been in the fifth ring? For more than 3 years. You basically did not leave your house. How can you know someone from another sect? Oh, I know. He's the same as you. Did he come from the same outer region? Ming Mu nodded. Senior brother is wise. You hit the nail on the head. But we don't come from the same realm. We come from 3 different realms under the same sky. Rugi was curious. You know him, but he doesn't know you? Ming Mu smiled bitterly. The situation was a little special. A total of 300 foundation establishment cultivators were intercepted. 60 of them were sent to the fifth ring. That cigarette, but was not among them. But later on, an accident happened. A cultivator from our realm, Chao Wendao, was killed. That's why he took his place. The whole process was very fast. We basically did not have time to interact with each other. In that short period of time, we can remember him, but he might not remember the 59 of us. As for the floating raft, everyone had their own space. No one interacted with each other. When we disembarked, it was the masters who led us away. We did not interact with each other. So we know him, but he doesn't know us. Rugi had a strange expression. You think that your friend was killed by him? That's why he had the chance to come to the fifth ring? Mingmu was very sure. At first, we only suspected it, but he wasn't sure. But later on, my master mentioned that when Grandmaster brought us here, 1 out of the 60 people was killed. In the end, the murderer took his place. Only then did I know that Brother One was harmed by this cigarette, but although the truth is out, there is no chance. Rugue smiled faintly. I understand, but you guys aren't too clear about the rules of the fifth ring. He couldn't touch the Tion family's bank because it involved the dignity of the dead cultivators. Everyone would die, and everyone would have relatives left behind in this world. This could not be allowed to happen. Once it happened, no one could guarantee that their family would not suffer a calamity after they left. But this does not contradict your demands. It's just that we don't use the Shun Bank as a reason. He was very confused. Senior brother, what reason should we use? Rugue raised an eyebrow. Why would a fifth ring cultivator need a reason to act? If you want to kill, go ahead and do it. What's more, you have a feud with him. This is a legitimate reason that is far more legitimate than some bullshit bank. This is karma. When cultivators resolve karma, do they need to have misgivings? Mingmu was still a bit hesitant. Senior brother, we want revenge, but we are afraid of bringing trouble to the sect. Rugue snorted coldly. Let me tell you some data. Just last year, when Xinyuan swordsmen went out, whether it was traveling, causing trouble, exploring, or some other reason, a total of 97 people were killed. Among them, 95 were outer swordsmen and 2 were inner swordsmen. And this is just the normal consumption. Otherwise, do you think that with their speed of taking in disciples, the dome wouldn't have burst open long ago? This year is still very little. In fact, in history, Xinyuan Foundation establishment swordsmen would lose over 100 every year. I'm not saying that Xinyuan is weak. Do you know how many Foundation establishment cultivators from our Supreme sect die every year? Over 200. Not only our Supreme sect, but the 3 pure ones as well. Your Myriad View sect isn't much better. This is the current situation of the fifth ring. All the great sects and powers use the fifth ring as a melting pot. If you can't endure it, you'll die. What reason do you need? Affect the sect? You're thinking too much. Even if 100 people like us die, it won't affect the higher-ups drinking tea somewhere. Let me ask you, do you want revenge? Are you afraid? If you've thought it through, just do it. What's the point of thinking so much? How can a 3-year-old swordsman from another domain affect the big picture? What a joke. This was the temperament of the great sects of the fifth ring. If they didn't dare to attack just because their opponent was a swordsman, what use would it be for the sect even if their realm was higher? It wasn't just the swordsmen who nurtured their disciples to be fearless. It was the same for the cultivators. Before the sects of the fifth ring gathered in the fifth ring, they were all great powers that dominated their own domain. Of course, their style was very prominent. But after they all came to the fifth ring, under the influence of tens of thousands of years, they naturally learned from each other's strengths to make up for their weaknesses. For example, sword cultivators would slowly change their past predicament of being too single-minded after a long period of contact, and the world they walked in would also become more tolerant. Dharma cultivators, on the other hand, had learned from sword cultivators how to be unyielding and unyielding. Rugue wasn't trying to sow discord or anything. He really thought that way. Of course, he thought it through very thoroughly. How much could a 3-year-old swordsman be capable of? Was he proficient in flying swords? What kind of background did he have from another domain? What kind of support did he have? How many friends could he have after 3 years of hard work in an unfamiliar place? Swordsmen were indeed very tight-knit. After killing one, there would always be more. You couldn't even hide in the sect because they would kill others to force you out. This swordsman was unlikely to do so. He was still growing. It would take him at least a few decades to fully integrate into the swordsman's circle. This was also the reason why he allowed the 2 cultivators to do as they pleased. Xuanyuan's inner sword was indeed very sharp. Only the most talented cultivators among the cultivators could contend against it. However, his outer sword was only on the same level as cultivators like them in battle. There was no advantage at all. Yisheng and Mingmu looked at each other and made up their minds. They weren't acting on impulse. This was a choice made after careful consideration. Just like Lu Xiaoyi, they came from another domain and had an awkward position in the sect. Without exceptional talent, how would they be able to obtain the resources of the large sects that were filled with geniuses? They didn't have any background, and their potential wasn't outstanding. It was impossible to look down on everyone in their original domain here. However, there was a way to improve here that other domains didn't have. Killing cultivators to prove one's Tao. The more cultivators you killed, the more you could prove your ability. Not only would the sect not blame you, they would even secretly condone you and give you resources. This was the logic of a bandit's den. Among all their enemies, the one who was most recognized and could prove their ability the most was to kill a swordsman. This was their true goal. As for Chao and Dao, he was only from the same domain. They had only met him twice or 3 times. How could they bear a grudge as if he had killed his father? Senior brother, let's do it. Tell us what's the best way to deal with him. Chapter 219. Smiling regal smile. He could also see very clearly and knew what these 2 junior brothers were thinking. They were just picking the soft persimmon to pinch. Could they find a more suitable target than this? Even he was a little tempted. Remember this. Be open and above board. You have grievances and karma, so you have a reason to attack. Your close friend's death is your motive. You don't need to hide it. Instead, you need to make a big fuss and let everyone know. You are also magic cultivators who have been in the sect for more than 3 years. You are not senior foundation establishment cultivators bullying a newcomer. As long as you publicize these 2 points, given Xinyuan swordsman's narcissistic nature, I can guarantee that they won't come to you for revenge. Don't hide it. It will only make things worse. Do you understand? Rugi was indeed a senior foundation establishment cultivator. He had a clear understanding of Xuanyuan's style of handling matters. According to him, if they succeeded in killing the young swordsman, it would be Xuanyuan's tacit approval. Seeing the 2 nodding, Rugi smiled with satisfaction. As for how to kill him, you were taught how to deal with flying swords the most in the sect, right? If the 2 of you can't even take down a young swordsman, let's see how you will explain it to the sect. Rugi had thought it through. If the 2 of them couldn't handle it well, he would personally step in and push the blame to them. He had decades of cultivation and was a core magic cultivator in the prime of his life. Although he wasn't elite, he couldn't deal with a small fry who had only been practicing swordsmanship for 3 years. Lu Xiaoyi left Minzhou's prefectural city and began to tour around the city. Carefree was fake. Finding a place to ambush people was his real goal. He was ready to kill. Why didn't he recognize those 2? His memory was outstanding, and he never forgot anything he saw. When the 6 nascent soul cultivators were selecting their disciples, he had already recognized all 60 of them. If the 2 of them had recognized him in Deshun's VIP lounge, they probably didn't have any ill intentions. But since they pretended not to know him, they definitely had ulterior motives. He only had one countermeasure: strike first and gain the upper hand. This had always been his habit. He would not go through the trouble of confirming, reasoning, or making friends. All he had to do was kill them. This was how he dealt with his troubles before he entered the Tao. He even found a guide, which was the yellow dog. This fellow was inextricably linked to the conflict this time, but he didn't ask about it in detail. The reason he kept it by his side was to make it easier for the 3 cultivators to find him. When it came to danger, he had his own judgment. In his opinion, the greatest danger came from ignorance. If he left now, he might be in an unstable and dangerous state at any time during the 6 months before he returned to the dome. If that was the case, it would be better to stay here and lure the danger out. As for the fact that there were 3 of them, this was just a secondary level of danger that could be dealt with through tactics. When it came to battle, he had an innate intuition and was never afraid. The Tian family patriarch and several elders of the family were nervously weighing the pros and cons. There were too many things that needed to be decided. Just the loans they had given out numbered in the hundreds. Which of these loans were for business and had to be recovered? Which of these loans were for individuals, and which of these loans were for poor families that couldn't raise money in a short period of time? All of this required their judgment. The more meticulous this matter was, the smaller their losses would be. They didn't think that the sky would collapse so quickly. Fortunately, the great ancestor's junior apprentice brother had bought them some time. This gave them hope that they could do things more meticulously and reduce their losses even more. The door to the inner room was suddenly violently pushed open. Taoist Wang rushed in. "Where's junior apprentice brother Yen? Is he here?" The Tian family patriarch hurriedly said, "I haven't seen Master in the past few days, but he said that he would wait for a month in Min Province Prefecture. I think he's probably searching around the prefectural city." Taoist Wang anxiously said, "What time is it? Searching for treasures?" Just now, news came from a city that Wushang and myriad View sect cultivators have an old grudge with junior apprentice brother Yin, and they're going to settle it through a battle. Hurry and send someone to inform junior apprentice brother Yin. This is a sign that Wushang is about to make a move. Although Taoist Wang didn't come from a large sect, he had lived for nearly 200 years and had seen all sorts of low-level cultivation worlds. He was well aware that Wushang's goal in releasing this news was to create momentum for killing the Xianyuan swordsman. The purpose of creating momentum was to tell everyone that Wushang wasn't doing anything sneaky, but was resolving their grudges in an open and honorable manner. But he also understood that since Wushang dared to create momentum now, it was because he was already determined to win and everything was ready. The reason he had the Tian family patriarch send someone to inform Wushang was only to feel at ease. Perhaps the battle had already begun, so how could it be too late? How could the Tian family patriarch understand the shady business of the cultivation world? He hurriedly ordered his subordinates to send people over while asking, "Master, we will immediately send people over. But with the advantage of searching for people, I fear that you cultivators will be faster, right?" Taoist Wang sighed. "It's not appropriate for me to go look for people." Of course it wasn't appropriate for him. For a mid-sized sect like them, the worst thing was to be caught in between several large powers. They were in a dilemma and had to suffer the humiliation of being sandwiched between them. Xianyuan, Wushang, myriad scenery sect, which one of these was something that a shaman sect could contend with? While it was said that a battle between low-level fifth ring cultivators wouldn't affect the overall situation, this still required them to be of equal status. His shaman sect could compete with other mid-sized sects, and Wushang could also make a move against Xianyuan swordsmen, but they were all on the same level of power. If his shaman sect dared to fight against Wushang or Xianyuan, then future Foundation establishment cultivators wouldn't dare to take a single step out of the mountain. This was the truth. Lu Xiaoyi was currently wandering aimlessly on a nameless mountain not far from the state capital under Huang Goyo's guidance. In Huang Goyo's opinion, this young cultivator's hobbies were very strange. He didn't like famous historical sites that were sought after by everyone, but he liked to go to remote places. Was this the realm of a true cultivator? He was a qi refining cultivator. Although he couldn't compare to a Foundation establishment cultivator, he was much stronger than a mortal's foot. Otherwise, he wouldn't be a guide for a Foundation establishment cultivator. Seeing that there was no road ahead, or rather, the fact that he couldn't fly, there was no road ahead. Thus, he suggested, "Master, there's really nothing to walk around in this place. Why don't we go somewhere else? There are no monks or Taoist temples on these mountains, nor are there any relics of famous people. At most, there are a few desolate pavilions, and they've been in disrepair for a long time. What's there to see?" Lu Xiaoyi chuckled. "It's perfect for burying people." Yellow Dog's heart thumped. Of course, he didn't think that this person was going to attack him. With his weight, there was no need to go through so much trouble. However, he really couldn't figure out this cultivator's thoughts. After thinking about it, he still felt that it had something to do with the 3 disciples from the large sects that he had attracted. "Master, I really had no choice. The loan from the bank, Lu Xiaoyi interrupted him. "From your point of view, you're not wrong. But from the bank's point of view, they're not wrong either. But you have to admit that what you're doing is immoral." Yellow Dog was speechless. Before he could say anything else, he saw that the other party had already leaped into the air, leaped forward, and disappeared behind the cliff in the blink of an eye. Chapter 220. Yellow Dog was puzzled. Suddenly, he felt a piercing sensation behind him. When he took a closer look, he saw 3 figures, 2 in front and 1 behind, quickly dashing behind the cliff. They were the masters of the 3 great sects that he had asked for help. At this point, the cause and effect of the entire sightseeing trip had been revealed. Who was the mantis? Who was the oriole? As soon as Lu Xiaoyi crossed the cliff, the sword case on his back trembled. The Four Seasons sword shot out, but it wasn't aimed at the pursuers behind him. It was aimed at the direction he was heading in. There was nothing there. He stuck to the cliff and activated the divine concealment technique. His mental strength far exceeded that of cultivators of the same level, and was slightly stronger than the old Foundation establishment stage cultivators of the same level. Therefore, he was able to discover the 3 spiritual vigor fluctuations that were quickly approaching him. He was able to escape at the perfect time, not letting his opponents lose track of him and not giving them a chance to make their next move. He was like an alert rabbit that instinctively flew towards the biggest barrier nearby after seeing its natural enemy, behind the cliff. The cliff couldn't block a cultivator's divine sense. However, without the help of his other 5 senses, especially his eyesight, his opponent could only sense a spiritium fluctuation rapidly leaving. He could also sense the powerful aura of the flying sword. His first judgment was that the cigarette was fleeing on his flying sword. The cliff was too high. If they were too high, it would affect their pursuit. The best way was to quickly chase after him. They weren't worried about being slower than the swordsman. In a long dispute between swordsman and magic cultivator, it wasn't absolute who was faster and who was slower. A late Foundation establishment swordsman's flying sword was very fast, but this didn't apply to a novice who had only cultivated for 3 years. Cultivation, the number of layers of restrictions on the flying sword, and the hardware and software all limited a novice's speed. However, they had the magic weapon that Senior Brother Rugi lent them, so they could erupt with speed that exceeded their ability for a short period of time. Moreover, Senior Brother Rugi was there. Where could he run to? The most important thing was that they had to keep the cigarette but in their line of sight. Cultivators had their own methods of how to quickly change direction and pursue while flying. For high-level cultivators, it was a matter of thought, but this kind of ability didn't belong to Foundation establishment. It was obvious that the swordsman had slightly changed his angle after brushing past the cliff in an attempt to use the obstruction of the cliff to change his direction. Since they knew the trajectory of the swordsman, they would naturally change their direction at the same time they brushed past the cliff. This was an instinctive body movement that did not require any consideration. It was the subconscious reaction of every living thing that could fly. It was accompanied by the adjustment of the mana circulation in the body, the adjustment of the body. Even for cultivators, inertia existed. This was especially true for Foundation establishment cultivators who had just learned how to fly. They had to maintain their speed and change their direction at the same time. The price they had to pay was the instantaneous consumption of their magic power. During a battle, they wouldn't do this rashly. They would always reserve enough magic power, just in case. However, they didn't need to do so now because the direction that the opponent's sword controlling technique was still far away. The danger level suddenly decreased. Just like in a racing car, the worst control was when they were drifting around corners. Because of the centrifugal force, Shang, Yi, and Underworld eyes couldn't change their direction at all. Because their magic power was still counteracting the huge centrifugal force, they couldn't make an appropriate response to attack or defend. The only thing they could do was to raise their arms to protect their head and face when they were in danger. Then, they used their remaining magic power to form a thin magic shield around their body. Under the sword energy, it was as fragile as an eggshell. 2 bright red flowers exploded in midair. It was an inevitable phenomenon when a vent appeared in the body that was full of magic power. Rugi and Yellow Dog, who were on the other side of the cliff, didn't see any of this. However, Yellow Dog was really confused. He couldn't understand the situation at all. Taoist Rugi was also confused. However, he was confused because there was too much information that suddenly appeared. He couldn't grasp the essence of the change. The two explosions of spiritual vigor were caused by the death of someone. Who was it? Was it his two junior brothers? Even with the two explosions of spiritual vigor, he could still feel the two spiritual vigors approaching rapidly, one in front and one behind. He was a century-old cultivator after all. He made a judgment in an instant. This must be the ambush of the Xianyuan swordsman. The cigarette but was in front of him to lure him, and the swordsman or his accomplice was hiding behind the cliff to ambush him. And now, after taking care of his two junior brothers, their next target was him. It must be like this. He immediately began to lower his body. This was the experience of an old cultivator. He couldn't change his direction because he would repeat the fate of his two junior brothers. He couldn't pull up either. In the sky, flying swords were always exceptionally sharp. He could only lower his body to the ground and rely on the complicated terrain on the ground to minimize the power of the flying swords. However, he was still a little too late. A figure flashed out from behind the cliff and pounced on him. Taoist Rugi was confused again. In his initial judgment, the 3-year-old swordsman, the cigarette butt, was just a bait. The one hiding behind the cliff was the real expert, the killer. But now, it was the cigarette butt that came out. He held a sword in his hand and was full of murderous intent. In his divine sense, the sword aura rushing from behind the cliff suddenly increased in speed, exceeding the normal speed of a sword. Then, was the cigarette but an expert? Or was the one behind him an expert? This was the first question. The second question was the cigarette but clearly wasn't riding a sword. So why was his speed so fast? He faintly had the aura of a star. Was he a swordsman or a spell cultivator? Why did a swordsman use star escape? Why did a spell cultivator use a sword? The greatest taboo when encountering an enemy was to make a wrong judgment. How many opponents were there? What orthodoxy? Who was strong and who was weak? Who was in charge and who was in charge? Taoist Rugi realized that he couldn't understand either. If he couldn't figure it out, he had to distance himself and take a closer look. He couldn't just charge forward in a daze. This was the century-old experience of an old cultivator. Therefore, even though he saw the cigarette, but coming at him menacingly, even though he knew that he was just a little sword cultivator of 3 years, and that there was a clear gap between him and him in terms of cultivation, he still didn't dare to face him head-on. First, there was another aura that would soon appear from behind the cliff. Second, swordsman's close combat skills were notorious in the 5th ring for being ruthless. He was afraid that he would be entangled and lose the space to escape. Therefore, a middle-stage foundation establishment cultivator who had been cultivating for decades and had stabilized his cultivation level for a long time chose to cower in front of a 3-year-old rookie foundation establishment cultivator. Both of them were charging downwards. Although the opponent's star escape was very advanced, Taoist Rugi was confident that he could shake him off and not get into the rhythm of close combat. At the same time, he waved his hand and threw out a series of talismans. Because he was moving quickly, he didn't have time to cast powerful spells. At his level, he couldn't cast instant spells either. Therefore, a series of basic icicles and water arrows became his only means of attack. Although their power was limited, they were fast and large in number. They could effectively delay the opponent. Most importantly, he had to focus his energy on defending against the opponent's flying sword. Losing one's vigilance in front of a swordsman was fatal. His delay was very effective. His opponent had no choice but to swing his sword to slash away a series of icicles. The closest point of contact between the two sides was only a few feet away, but that was all. Any further, and Lao Yan would fly away, and his opponent would no longer be able to intercept him. Just as he let out a sigh of relief, his mind suddenly trembled. In an instant, it was as if he had lost control of his body. Chapter 221. In Rugi's sight, a sword light flashed from behind the cliff. It was not very fast, nor was it very powerful. The sword momentum was not very sharp. However, his mind could not control his body. In these 2 or 3 breaths, he could only watch as the flying sword pierced through his chest. He finally understood. From the beginning to the end, there was only one swordsman. It was this cigarette, but who had only practiced swordsmanship for 3 years. The other aura was not that of a person, but a flying sword that was flying into the air. Just based on this point alone, the sword cultivator had killed them 3 times. He finally understood what a real battle was, but it was too late. When darkness fell, he was still thinking, was it the sword that made the swordsman? Or was it the swordsman who made the sword? Why was it that he could not see such an extraordinary talent in battle in other orthodoxies? However, in Yellow Dog's eyes, it was a completely different scene. The swordsman stood with his hands behind his back, breathing deeply, as if the blood in the air was the best tonic. His body swayed slightly, as if he was enjoying the pleasure of killing. This demon, who would have thought that such a bright young cultivator would have such a cruel heart? He stood there in a daze, not daring to make a single move. He knew that he was the only witness, but the question was, would this demon kill him to silence him? After enjoying himself for a few breaths, the Xianyuan demon made a turn in the air, looking at the bodies falling down the mountain stream, and smiled at Yellow Dog. Sorry to trouble you to guide us for so many days, but this mountain stream doesn't seem very high, right? Then he floated away. It took the Yellow Dog a full 10 minutes to regain full control of its body. It knew that it had dodged the attack. He had his own interpretation of the Xianyuan swordsman's last sentence. It was obvious that the reward for being a guide was from the remains of the 3 dead. There was 1 here, and there were 2 more behind the cliff. Yellow Dog, left over, suddenly realized that its luck seemed to be turning for the better. No matter how deep the stream was, he had to fall down and climb back up. No one could stop him. It took him an entire day to find all the storage rings of the 3 cultivators. Fortunately, this place was deserted and no one came to disturb him. In fact, he didn't know if he had missed anything. Anyway, with his ability, this was the best he could do. A total of 9 storage rings. What made him embarrassed was that he couldn't open a single one. There were 2 paths in front of him. The first was to keep it for himself, and the second was to find the Xianyuan swordsman and let him take charge of it. He wanted to see how many benefits he could get. As the reward for being a guide, even a few spirit stones were a lot. This was the reason why he was hesitant. After struggling for a while, he still chose to look for the swordsman. It was not that he could withstand the test of resources, but that he could not open the storage rings of these Foundation establishment cultivators in a short period of time, let alone know if there were any traps in them. He still had his parents and elders. He had already put them in danger once. He didn't want to do it again. At the very least, he no longer had the burden of debt. He didn't need to take the biggest risks for everything. After this change, he found that he had no room to struggle in front of a real cultivator. The so-called struggle for life was so laughable. The cruelty of the cultivation world was far beyond his imagination, just like the masters of the 3 major sects. So what if he had the ability? If he was careless, he would be slaughtered like a dead dog. Lu Xiaoyi returned to his own inn, but he knew that he couldn't stay here for a month as he had expected. Now that 7 days had passed, he had to leave after 3 days at most. Wushan's reaction might not be so fast. The mountain was high and the road was long, but Wan Jinglu was different. After all, he was only in the early stage of Foundation establishment. He didn't have the strength to wait here for Wushang and Wan Jinglu to challenge him one after another. His plan was built on tactics, not strength. He was well aware of this. If he left, he might not be a coward. If he stayed, he might not be a hero. He wouldn't do things for reputation. That was not his style. There were people from the Deshun Bank keeping an eye on the inn, so as soon as he returned, the Tian family head rushed over and said, "Disaster! It's a disaster! It's a disaster! Master Yin, those 3 Taoists want to harm you. What should we do? If you leave, what should we do?" Lu Xiaoyi looked at him. He didn't know whether this old fellow was sincere or not, but he had his own way of dealing with it. "I've already met them, but I still have to thank you. even if your news came a bit late. The Tian family head had an expectant look. You've met them? How was the discussion? Did everyone shake hands and make peace? Can our bank? Lu Xiaoyi interrupted his fantasy. I estimate that the three of them are talking to the King of Hell right now, so I'm preparing to run away. As for you, old Tian, you can continue to dawdle until someone comes to cause trouble for the Deshun Bank. You can place your hopes on Taoist Wang. Maybe he can shoulder the burden for you. The Tian family head fell down on his butt. He didn't understand. How could there be blood here? How could this develop into an unsalvageable situation? Lu Xiaoyi lightly said, the matters of the world of cultivation have nothing to do with you. This is the general direction. But if you still have delusions and dawdle here, waiting for the light to shine at the end of the tunnel, I can't guarantee that no one will come to cause trouble for you. Do as you see fit. This is the last time I will help you. If a family clan is too greedy and doesn't know when to back down, then no one can save them. The Tian family had left in a daze. Now, the Tian family had to accept that they had no cultivators to protect them. This was a cycle of reincarnation. From the beginning of cultivation until the end of cultivation, it wasn't just the Tian family. There were countless families like this throughout the 5 ring continents. Because of the rise of someone in their family, they would prosper, and because of the death of that person, they would decline. If they could accept this, they would continue to live. If they couldn't, then they would fall apart. On the evening of the second day, a figure quietly entered his room. A total of 9 storage rings. The rest are personal clothes. I've already buried them so that they won't be eaten by beasts after death. Lu Xiaoyi wasn't pretentious. He wasn't the kind of person who would fight over a small amount of money just because someone paid him a small amount of money. You stay away. The yellow dog retreated to the wall until he couldn't retreat any further. He had already realized something, but he still didn't know what it was. Lu Xiaoyi swung his spirit and slammed it into one of the storage rings. With a bang, the storage ring burst into a ball of light. Everything in the ring disappeared, leaving nothing behind. The yellow dog saw it clearly from the corner of the wall. Cold sweat flowed down his back. Although the power of the storage ring was limited, if it was close enough, even with his qi refinement stage cultivation, he wouldn't be spared. Lu Xiaoyi glanced at him. This is the rule of the world of cultivation. Don't take all the benefits for yourself. You can't take all the benefits, and you can't enjoy all the blessings. You can only go further if you know how to share. Chapter 222. 5 out of the 9 storage rings were destroyed. Needless to say, the remaining 4 must belong to Yi Sheng and Mingmu. They hadn't been in the sect for long enough, so they didn't have enough money to use these storage rings. To Lu Xiaoyi's surprise, the 4 storage rings dropped a lot of things. There were more than 600 mid-grade spirit stones, and there were also some random things, including a few low-level magic tools, jade slips, and so on. This was normal. Xinyuan Sword Sect's welfare was average, and it couldn't be compared to a well-known Taoist sect like Wushang. Even he could earn 200 spirit stones a year, so it was normal for these two to save up so many spirit stones. They were used to living a hard life in their original world, so they knew how to save money. They weren't like most of the local cultivators who lived on borrowed money. Lu Xiaoyi divided the items into 2 piles, and he didn't count them in detail. Pick a pile and go your way. Yellow Dog didn't expect such a result. This was a huge sum of money for him. He wanted to decline, but he couldn't. He needed these spirit stones too much for his future. He wanted to thank him, but after a few days of interaction, he already understood the character of the cultivator in front of him. He didn't like to dawdle and act pretentiously. He didn't say much and knelt down to pay his respects. Then he picked up a pile and went out. He had already thought it through. He would pay back the debt to Deshun first, and then he would leave with his parents. Master was right. He couldn't enjoy all the blessings. Since Master had shared the blessings with him, he must pay back what he owed. Otherwise, he wouldn't be at ease. Lu Xiaoyi didn't have anything else to worry about. He went out of the window and saw that the direction of Deshun was brightly lit. People were shouting and horses were neighing, as if they were fleeing for their lives. It seemed that Master Tian finally understood the key point and began to disperse. If he could make such a decision, there was still hope. Lu Xiaoyi took advantage of the night to fly out of Minzhou City. He had his own plan on how to go back. Going back in a straight line was the usual way of swordsmen, but he wasn't fast enough. They could only take a detour. Although it was further away, it was impossible to track them down. Xin Yuan's swordsman's so-called creed, he did not take it to heart. His life was more important. So why was he pretending to be a hero? He had already chosen his path. In fact, it was like a bow. When he came, he walked on the bowstring, and when he returned, he walked on the body of the bow. He took a slight detour, but this detour made it impossible for others to guess. There were countless choices, and it was impossible to chase after him. After all, this was the western regions where Xin Yuan was in charge. It was impossible for Wu Shuang to send a lot of Zhuji to look for him. Although Wan Jinglu was also a landlord, he was still weaker than Xin Yuan. He could do it in private, but he wouldn't do it openly. This was just a precaution. Just like how Rugi and the others judged that Xin Yuan would not react to the death of his cigarette, but the deaths of these three people might not cause an excessive reaction from Wu Shang and Wan Jinglu. They were just small characters. Whether they could be noticed or not depended purely on the rotation of the fate compass. But to them, this was everything. Since he had chosen to take a longer detour, of course, he couldn't rush through the journey in a hurry. If he flew through the air, it was equivalent to telling others that he was running. If he took a longer detour, he had to take a longer detour. He had to be comfortable, relaxed, and careless. Lu Xiaoyi loved this kind of state the most. There was no psychological pressure, no clear mission direction, no deep hatred, and no one that he had to rush to meet. It was as if the whole world didn't know him, and he was just looking at it from an outsider's point of view. When the official road was clear and direct, he would usually choose to ride a horse or follow a caravan. Only when he encountered mountains, rivers, and natural moats, where he had to take a big detour to follow the pace of mortals, would he choose to use the cultivator's method. This way, he could fully appreciate the local customs of the Fifth Ring Road and not waste too much time. He had always had a small regret. When he was in the lower 3 stars, he had never really had a relaxing trip since he transmigrated. Most of the time, he was bored in Pu City and the Gobi Desert. The few times he went out, he had a clear goal. He was in a hurry, so he didn't have time to see the people and scenery around him. Now, he didn't have a chance to see them. Now that he was in the Fifth Ring Road, he wanted to make up for this regret. Moreover, this was also a kind of cultivation. Most of Lu Xiaoyi's life philosophy came from his previous life. In the lower 3 stars, he had limited contact with the world, so he was lacking in this aspect. The sooner he entered the mortal world, the better. If he became a half-immortal and then entered the mortal world, it would be a game, not an experience. The key was that in interacting with mortals, he could find a lot of fun that he couldn't find in the cultivation world. He really enjoyed this kind of fun. In the lower stars, he had lost all his family and friends. It was as if he had lost interest in exploring the entire star field. However, this was the 5th ring. It was a new world, a grander and more magnificent world. He hoped that he could have a new beginning, new friends, and a new home. This was what he had to do. Even if his heart was still lonely, he had to do it on the surface. This would allow him to live longer. This was a free trip. Sometimes he rode alone. Sometimes he traveled with a caravan. Sometimes he walked with a few monks. Sometimes he rode with a few young heroes. Along the way, he experienced the people, historical relics, and cultural heritage of the Fifth Ring Road. He gradually found that there was a gap in the history of the Fifth Ring Road. Less than 20,000 years ago, the history of the Fifth Ring Road had undergone earth-shaking changes. Everything before was very vague, as if it was a blank. Only after that did everything bloom. He was not immortal. When he was in the sect, he had dabbled in the history of the sect. He knew that this was actually the history of the invaders. Almost all of the middle-sized sects and above in the Fifth Ring Road were outsiders. They were once the tyrannical forces of the 3 major galaxies. The Zhuozhou Galaxy, the Gemini Galaxy, and the Great Thousand Corridor were the forces of these 3 galaxies that rebuilt the Fifth Ring Road, forming a very diverse cultural heritage. It was not only integrated with each other, but also independent. Every place he passed by had a new experience. This was very interesting. This was a galaxy that was rebuilt by the invaders. It was just that too much time had passed. In the past 20,000 years, not to mention mortals, even high-level cultivators had changed several times. Who could still remember who was the master of the Fifth Ring Road 20,000 years ago? He spent more time riding alone. During this time, he would not find a town to rest. Instead, he would cultivate in the wilderness. Because the direction of his cultivation was more towards the stars, his cultivation process did not have the unique aura of a swordsman unless he used his flying sword. However, on the way back, he no longer carried the sword case. Since he was going back secretly, he could not use the name of a swordsman. A month later, in a quiet valley, Lu Xiaoyi, who had finished his cultivation, finally released his flying sword. A month had passed, and he no longer needed to be cautious. In such a vast region, unless a high-level cultivator deliberately searched for him, it was impossible for a Foundation establishment cultivator to find his whereabouts. It was also time for him to practice his sword. He had not used his sword for a month, and had not even nurtured it. He felt a little rusty. He still lacked the aura of a swordsman. He could not live and die with the flying sword. However, when the flying sword came out of the sword case, he immediately felt something different. Chapter 223. P.S. Begging for monthly votes, begging for subscriptions, begging for everyone's support for my new book. A feeling came from the flying sword. It was no longer a simple flying sword, but it contained a kind of emotion. Lu Xiaoyi immediately realized that the four-season sword had given birth to a sword spirit. The flying sword was as vigorous as a dragon in the valley, spiraling up and down, as if it was venting its dissatisfaction for being trapped for a month. Although it was the most basic awakening of the sword spirit, it couldn't be compared with the previous awakening of the sword spirit. The maximum distance of the flying sword suddenly increased from 100 feet to 200 feet. Regardless of power or speed, there was a qualitative improvement in all aspects, especially control. This was because the flying sword was no longer an inanimate object, but a sword spirit with basic instincts to control it. He no longer needed to exert effort to control it, but only needed to issue a simple command, and the sword spirit would complete the specific movements of the flying sword. This feeling of controlling the sword made one feel relaxed and happy, as if there was nothing that could not be done. After a long time, Lu Xiaoyi, who was still not satisfied, pressed the four-season sword back into the sword box and began to think about why this thing had undergone such a huge change. It was harder for a flying sword to give birth to a sword spirit than for a cultivator to become a high-level cultivator. Under normal circumstances, the whole process was a long period of contact between the cultivator and the flying sword, almost inseparable from the person's back, unpredictable life and death battles, daily contact with a flying sword, and after hundreds and thousands of years of communication, there was a small chance that the flying sword would give birth to a sword spirit. In the history of Xianyuan Sword School, there had never been a Foundation establishment cultivator who had successfully cultivated a sword spirit. This was because they did not have enough time to nurture their flying swords. Was there such a person in Jindan? Not sure. Even if there were, they would be extremely rare and outstanding individuals. Only when one reached Yuanying would a sword spirit gradually appear. This was also one of the most important factors to measure the strength of an external sword Yuanying. Then, on what basis did he, a newcomer who had only practiced the sword for 3 years and was even somewhat inexperienced, have the qualifications to obtain a sword spirit? With Lu Xiaoyi's character, he did not believe in miracles. Even if there was a miracle, why should it fall on his head? It was supposed to be a free trip, but because of the appearance of the sword spirit, he was pleasantly surprised and began to worry. He had to figure out the origin of the sword spirit. How did it come into being? Along the way, he had been thinking about this question. He had to carry the sword sheath on his back because only by continuously communicating with this newborn sword spirit would he be able to slowly discover the truth. However, to his disappointment, the four-seasoned sword spirit was now like a one-year-old child. It had no way of communicating with him at all. For example, where did you come from? How was it generated? When was it formed? It did not know anything at all. It only had its own instincts, the instincts of the sword. Everything else was still in the process of learning. Moreover, this learning process was abnormally slow, far slower than a normal human child. Lu Xiaoyi had changed from a happy traveler to a traveler with a heavy heart. He had no choice but to slowly sort out the recent events that had happened to him in order to determine the origin of the sword spirit. He had to do this because this was the key to mass-producing flying swords with sword spirits. The good news was that he had finally found a swordsman style that belonged solely to him. His persistence had finally paid off. The bad news was that he did not know the reason behind it. If he could not find the reason behind it, he would not be able to realize his dream. It was like a carrot hanging in front of a donkey. You could see its bright colors and smell its sweet fragrance, but you could not bite it. He roughly believed that there were a few possibilities for the birth of a sword spirit. The first possibility was the material of the sword embryo. Could it be that the sword embryo he had bought had gradually produced a sword spirit after being shelved for a long time? And then he, Lu Xiaoyi, would meet it by chance? This was the result he was most unwilling to face. If that was really the case, it meant that it could not be replicated. In theory, it was not very possible because of the material. An inner sword pill and an outer sword flying sword were two different concepts. An inner sword pill was in a specific space, such as the small world of the sword tomb in Xinyuan. There was no human interference during the entire process. After a sword spirit was formed into a sword pill, it would undergo a two-way choice with a human. In fact, sword pills were very picky and proud. This was why there were countless failures that became outer swords. An outer sword spirit was completely different from an inner sword pill. It was almost born under the accompaniment of a human, not only in battle, but also in daily life of cultivation. This was the purpose of carrying a sword case. How is it a sword case? It was more like a baby nurturing box. It could be said that the outer sword flying sword spirit could be understood as the projection of a swordsman's spiritual will on the flying sword. After a long period of perseverance, it would form a sword spirit that completely belonged to oneself. The relationship between an inner sword pill and its master could be a friendship or a father-son relationship. This kind of sword spirit was more intelligent and independent. Occasionally, it could even throw a tantrum. After its master left, it would regain its freedom and return to the world until it disappeared. The outer sword spirit and its master's relationship was a twin. The coexistence relationship was like the relationship between your brain and your hands. This kind of sword spirit was less flexible and independent, but its obedience was unparalleled. When its master died, it would die the moment it died. Therefore, a flying sword with a sword spirit could not be passed to others. Even if a father passed it to his son, or a master passed it to his disciple, it would not work. This was because the sword spirit would not recognize it. It was because of these reasons that Lu Xiaoyi did not think that this sword embryo sword spirit had its own consciousness and coincidentally met him. He felt that the sword spirit would completely carry out his orders. Its characteristics were exactly the same as those sword spirits that had been nurtured for hundreds of years. The second possibility was because of the cultivation technique. Sword Song of the Four Seasons. Perhaps this was a great secret hidden among the thousands of swordsmanships in the outer sword. The sword technique with the lowest level and the lowest ranking was actually the best sword technique in the entire Boa Tower. It was able to nurture a sword spirit in advance. This was in line with the style of biographies and novels. It was also in line with the wishes of people who sought to reap without sowing. It was also the charm of cultivation. But was it possible? Tens of thousands of swordsmen, including the experienced and knowledgeable elders and high-level cultivators, could only watch as a sword technique that could change the history of the outer sword technique was placed in the Sword Turtle Tower and collected dust. The Sword Song of the Four Seasons was actually a 5-layered sword array. Could it be that the five elements could stimulate the spirit? It did not make sense. The third possibility was the chasing luck in his sea of consciousness. This was the only cheat he knew of. It was basically useless and lifeless. No matter how he flipped it or stimulated it, there was no reaction. He really could not see the connection between it and the sword spirit. In the countless times he had used the flying sword, the sword spirit and the chasing luck did not have any interaction. The last possibility was the pearl left behind by Senior Brother Gubei. He had indeed used it in battle. It was the sole fighting technique he had used against Ru Gui. This had given him a few precious breaths of time. Could it be that because of this, it coincided with some kind of heavenly axiom condition and stimulated the birth of the sword spirit? Chapter 2:24. Lu Xiaoyi continued to experiment and move forward in this confusion. His flying sword was getting sharper and sharper, but he was still confused about the birth of the sword spirit. This confusion accompanied him for more than half a year. He had already passed the center of the hunchback and was approaching Xinyuan. The current situation was that if someone wanted to intercept him, it would be easier. However, he had already entered Xuanyuan's sphere of influence. He realized that someone was following him. It was a very clever tracking. He could feel that someone was behind him, but he couldn't find his specific location. This was an inconceivable thing to him. His spiritual power was strong, and his divine sense could cover a wide area. However, it was obvious that the other party's spiritual power was stronger than his. Therefore, he was within the range of the other party's divine sense. But his divine sense couldn't cover the other party. Who was it? Was it Jin Dan? Did the Supreme or Wanjing sects, Jin Dan, dare to behave atrociously in Xuanyuan's sphere of influence? Did he break the rules? He valued spiritual power very much. In his opinion, if a cultivator's spiritual power was strong, then he wouldn't be weak in other aspects. He set up a few mazes, turned around to intercept, hid, and suddenly changed directions. However, none of them succeeded. This person's strength did not lie solely in his spiritual power. At the very least, he had experience in traveling the world and was very good at using spells. The only reason Lu Xiaoyi was able to notice him was because of the faint trace of his spiritual power that shrouded him intermittently from afar, causing him to feel some kind of malicious gaze. He even rested for several days in a place where he ate, drank, and played in a certain city. He would suddenly rush out in the middle of a good night, hoping to discover that mysterious presence. Unfortunately, he never succeeded. When he couldn't take it anymore and left the city, that presence faintly appeared again. Although he didn't show up and didn't fight, Lu Xiaoyi knew that he wasn't a match for him. After many fruitless efforts, he chose to continue his journey. He was very clear that with the other party's strength, even if he flew at full speed, he wouldn't be able to escape. On the contrary, he might even provoke the other party. If it was an enemy, if it was an avenger from Wanjing's sect, why didn't he choose to make a move now? Why did he drag it out from behind? Between the various sects, there was a kind of face-slapping called a naked face-slapping. Even if I don't kill you outside, I'll kill you in your own territory. This was confidence in his own strength, and also a blatant provocation. Most people wouldn't be so crazy, but this didn't include those who were truly blessed by the heavens, those who stood at the top of the food chain, those who were genius in spell techniques, body cultivation maniacs, internal swordsmen. Currently, Lu Xiaoyi's position was still within the sphere of influence of other sects under Xuanyuan's influence. He had yet to truly enter the sphere of influence of Xuanyuan's sword faction. If Lu Xiaoyi's guess was correct, this person should be waiting for him to truly enter the sphere of influence of Xinyuan before making a move. This was going to be another classic in the battle between a Dharma cultivator and a swordsman. The awkward thing was that he didn't have any good ideas about this. Counting his trump cards, he definitely couldn't use his mental strength, and his battle tactics might not be as good as his opponents. If he really had to look into it, he didn't know if the four-seasoned sword, which had just given birth to a sword spirit, could be counted as one of them. He was still skeptical. He didn't have the fearless temperament of a Xianyuan swordsman, who would rather die than fight with others. This person was very strong and couldn't be compared to the 3 cultivators in Minzhou City. Putting aside his life to talk about temperament, he was just a hooligan. After thinking about it, there seemed to be only one thing left in his arsenal: the divine concealment technique. As a newbie who had only entered the sect for 3 years, he indeed had pitifully few tricks up his sleeve. This wasn't his fault. In fact, every newbie like him was like this. He could be considered to have some tricks up his sleeve, and his mental strength could definitely be considered as his trump card. However, compared to a cultivator who had cultivated for more than 100 years and whose abilities were among the best, this bit of ability of his was somewhat insufficient. At his current level, the cultivators he came into contact with were unaccomplished cultivators like Gu Bei and Rugi, as well as newbies like Sheng Yi and Mingmu. This was originally the normal path of cultivation, but he had made an abnormal kill, which naturally attracted the attention of higher-level cultivators. In the end, he had brought this upon himself. He had to make a decision as soon as possible. The closer he was to Xianyuan, the less space he had to move around. In order to achieve his goal, he began to consciously walk through the city more often, because he could meet more cultivators here. The wilderness was too vast, and the chances of meeting cultivators from other orthodoxies weren't high, let alone the swordsmen. Moreover, he had never met them before, so what right did he have to ask for their help and involve them in this matter? He had never realized that although he didn't have the courage of a swordsman, he had the arrogance of not asking for help for anything. He solved his own problems on his own. This was a habit he had developed after drifting in the universe for countless years, and it was also something he had always insisted on in his original world. Even now, nothing had changed. He still hadn't found the right opportunity. The cultivators he often met along the way seemed to have collectively disappeared. He couldn't see them in the sky, nor could he see them in the city. He couldn't figure it out, no matter how much he thought about it. Of course, Lu Xiaoyi didn't know that a large sect nearby was holding a Dharma assembly. It was said that there would be an expert's speech, a powerful cultivator's performance, and many other benefits. This was a Dharma assembly aimed at low-level cultivators, so most of the wandering Foundation establishment cultivators had rushed over, and the whole area seemed empty. Without his peers, his plan couldn't be carried out. He couldn't do anything by himself, no matter what, until he saw that clean city again, Halua City. The reason he returned to his old path was that he felt that there was no need to go around in circles, since he had already been caught. He might as well just fly straight to Xianyuan, which would be much more enjoyable. After wandering around Halua City, luck finally came to him. His chance had come. He found a decent restaurant and treated himself well. In the next 2 months, he might not have the chance to leisurely eat and drink. The night slowly deepened. 2 silhouettes stood quietly on the tallest building in Halua City, a wooden pagoda of a Taoist temple in the city. Their gazes were fixed on the brightly lit areas of the city. Usually, there wouldn't be any businesses in such a lively place at night other than entertainment venues. That brat ran away quickly. We only just discovered him and let him run into the city. Otherwise, if we stopped him outside, the 2 of us would have already started our journey back, right? One of the cultivators snorted coldly. The other cultivator laughed. His starlight guidance can't fool us. It's him. So what if he hid in the city? Won't he never come out? Or will he ask Xianyuan for help? We'll wait for him for 3 days. If he doesn't come out in 3 days, I'll go in and drag him out. Using mortals as a cover, if news of this were spread, where would Xuanyuan's face be? A 3-year-old swordsman. We can control the power of our spells, but he might not be able to control the damage of his flying sword. If he really did hurt mortals, it's most likely him. Chapter 225. In the 5th ring, the cultivation world didn't care much about battles and killings between cultivators, but the relationship between cultivators and mortals was very important. No matter what the reason was, once a mortal was harmed, the punishment would be very severe. Of course, mortals who actively sought death were exceptions. But if it was a battle between cultivators like them, if the battlefield was set in a city, unless no one ever found out, it would be a serious crime. This was also the reason why they were unwilling to act rashly, even though they knew that the target had entered the city. They were afraid of accidents, so the best method was to wait for the target to leave Haloa. The two of us are quite lucky to be able to intercept him in Haloa, but the other brothers are in trouble. They made a wasted trip, and they might even encounter other swordsmen. If you ask me, we should have moved the location a bit closer to the center of the city and killed Xuan Yuan's prestige. We should have let them know that swordsman isn't the #1 in the world. Look at them. Their eyes are growing on top of their heads. Of course, this was just to boost their courage. If they really had such thoughts, they wouldn't have set the location at Haloa City, which was still 2 months away from the dome. The other cultivator had been very careful and had never relaxed his surveillance of that person. Although he couldn't see with his eyes, for a super large orthodox Taoist sect like Wushang, there was no shortage of special cultivation methods. With their identities as senior foundation establishment cultivators, they didn't lack methods. Moreover, that brat didn't seem to be deliberately hiding. It seemed that now that they were close to the dome, their vigilance had dropped a lot. This was good news. This brat, he went to the turbid hall area after eating and drinking to his heart's content. The other cultivators sneered. Xin Yuan swordsmen are all like this. They cultivate the sword, not morality. They don't have any sense of propriety, justice, integrity, or shame. I really don't know how they managed to bring out swordsmen. But junior brother Rugi is also a good-for-nothing. The 3 of us surrounded one person, and we were all wiped out. No one would believe this. Otherwise, Martial Uncle wouldn't have sent us out. It's really a disgrace. The 2 of them seemed to be chatting happily, but in fact, their attention had been focused on the faint fluctuation of spiritual vigor in the entertainment area of Haloa City. They were both Foundation establishment veterans with rich combat experience. Both of them were in the late stage of Foundation establishment. Although they were not at the top of the group of Supreme Foundation establishment, they were still the backbone figures. They were not comparable to Ru Gue, who was not proud of himself. This time, they came to Thousand View Stream to have an exchange between the low-level disciples of the 2 sections. This kind of exchange was very common in the 5th ring, but they didn't expect that Rugi and the other 2 would die at the hands of swordsmen who had only been in the sect for 3 years. It was really a slap in the face, and because of the anger of the crowd, the story of how they split up to intercept Rugi was born. Lu Xiaoyi's analysis was actually correct, but he forgot that a cultivator's face was often more important than life. On the watchtower of the southern gate, there was also a figure quietly standing there. He was wearing a white robe and had nothing on him. This was very rare among Foundation establishment cultivators, and it meant that he was extremely confident in his own strength. He had been following that person for almost a month. Although it was boring, it was also a test of his tracking ability. He had to admit that this person was very difficult to deal with. His strength was trash, but he was as cunning as a fox. Even with his ability, he almost gave himself away a few times. He didn't like this kind of mission. He hoped that it would end soon, so that he could do something more meaningful. In a certain remote courtyard in Haloa City, 5 Foundation establishment cultivators were in the midst of preparing themselves. The leader of the group was constantly reminding them. Junior brothers, although the Lake Mountain Spiritual Conference is in full swing, there are always some shady people who ignore the rules and treat the rules of our righteous law sect as a joke. They take pride in being able to stay in Haloa City. It's as if they have gained a lot of face. Let's do the opposite. We have to catch them at the scene tonight and properly sweep away the face of these shameless people. We have to let them know that the rules of our righteous law sect are not for them to hear, but for them to see. His junior martial brothers agreed one after another. The leading cultivator continued, "That's right. Because there are only a few people, we don't need to arrange too many people. I have already made a promise with martial uncles. This time, the few of us will be responsible for the inspection. Everyone, be careful. If there are any mishaps and we can't even complete such a small task, none of us will have a good time in front of martial uncles." Everyone agreed in unison. The Righteous Law Sect's night inspection was not done every day. Usually, it was done once a month. No one would place the sect's main focus on this. But occasionally, there would be a sudden inspection, depending on the situation. Marshal Uncle Jean Dan did not follow every inspection. After all, the people who came here for fun were basically all Foundation establishment cultivators. Jean Dan rarely appeared. As soon as he heard the slightest movement, he would immediately run away to avoid any awkwardness. Regarding this, the Righteous Law sect did not care. This time, it was considered a sudden inspection. Because the number of cultivators in Hulua City had decreased recently, they did not need to use too much strength. 5 Foundation establishment cultivators were enough. Everyone knew the rules of Hulua City. No one would really fight over this matter. Basically, they would laugh and accept their punishment. It was also because of the unique rules of Hulua City that it attracted many unruly cultivators from the Fifth Ring. They would take pride in being able to spend the night here and play hide-and-seek with the Righteous Law sect cultivators. This would give them something to talk about. It was very annoying for the Righteous Law sect cultivators. The 5 people went out in a single file. They did not fly because it would be easy to expose their whereabouts. Instead, they walked forward. Halfway through, they tacitly split up and blocked the several entrances and exits of the area. They were very familiar with this. There was no need for command. Everything was done in an orderly and strict manner. This was only an extremely ordinary inspection. After finishing, they could go back and cultivate a few cycles. Lu Xiaoyi strolled through the night of Hulua City. The city was clean, but because of the strict control of all aspects, it lacked the liveliness of other cities. There were no hawkers walking the streets, no bustling crowds, and of course, no thieves. There were no melons or candy pits all over the ground. Everything was like this. There were pros and cons. It all depended on how you chose. The only hawker in his line of sight was an old man selling candied hawthorns. Obviously, he was forced by life and had no choice but to take the risk to walk the streets. However, since very few people came out, his business was naturally not very good. There were still more than half of the candied hawthorns on the straw target. According to the current situation, he feared that he would not be able to sell them all tonight. Lu Xiaoyi took out a piece of loose silver and handed it over. However, the old man clearly did not have change. Although it was only a piece of silver, it was enough to buy several of his candied hawthorns. Lu Xiaoyi smiled and shook his head. He took the straw target and slung it over his shoulder. Amidst the old man's endless gratitude, he took one of the candied hawthorns and placed it in his mouth to lick. The taste was not bad. It was sweet and sour. After turning 2 corners, there were actually 2 small customers who ran over to take care of his business. He stuffed 2 skewers into each person's hands and walked forward happily. When he passed by a dark corner, he quickly changed into civilian clothes. At the very least, he didn't look like a cultivator at first glance. Soon, they arrived at the entertainment street. They stuck the straw target into the ground and opened their mouths to shout. Righteous Law Sect Night Inspection. Unrelated mortals, step aside. Chapter 2:26. With this roar, the entire street immediately fell into chaos. Mortals didn't care, but the scattered cultivators were different. Whether or not they could successfully escape the punishment of the Righteous Law Sect was something they could brag about. Chi refining cultivators didn't dare to move, but Foundation establishment cultivators were prepared. 3 silhouettes immediately flew out of the window after a certain vile voice sounded. They flew in different directions like rainbows, like roaming dragons. At the same time, Lu Xiaoyi activated his divine concealment technique and began to slowly leave the area at the pace of an ordinary person. He was like a normal person who saw cultivators fly into the sky and burrow into the ground. He was both surprised and indifferent. The approaching Righteous Law Sect cultivators were very surprised to see 3 auras spreading out in all directions. They knew that they had been defeated. This was not something new during night patrols, so they split up to intercept them. In River Luo City, this kind of interception was basically just for show. It was a competition of speed, and neither side would beg for mercy. The Seeking Spring cultivators would not offend a local tyrant like the Righteous Law sect over such a trivial matter, and the Righteous Law sect would not harm the escaping cultivators over such a trivial matter. But this time it was different, because there were still several auras rapidly approaching. Two of them came from the Taoist temple in the city, while the other came from the city gate. Unlike the cultivators in the entertainment area who had a game mentality, these two auras were purely for battle, because they were all well-known figures who had grown up in the cruel competition of the fifth ring. The candied hawthorn seller looked at the sky with the attitude of watching a show, but he discovered that his shout had called out even more people of unknown origin. According to his judgment, it should be a few panicked Seeking Spring cultivators and another mysterious person who had been watching him for a month or so. But now there were two more groups. One group was still within reason as the Righteous Law sect cultivators came out to enforce the law, but the other group came out of nowhere. He still hadn't figured out what was going on below, but a fierce battle suddenly broke out in the sky. At this time, no one cared whether they were in the sky above a mortal city or not. When it came to life and death, the essence of a cultivator was undoubtedly exposed. The cultivators flying from the Taoist temple continuously used spells. One was as fiery as a torch, the other was as cold as frost. But fortunately, they hadn't completely lost their minds and only used single-target spells, not area of effect spells. The reason why they didn't care about the spells in the sky was because they had no other choice. Because the white figure flying from the city gate was also very familiar to Lu Xiaoyi, the mysterious person who had been pestering him for nearly a month. He was the real one who made the first move. 1, 2, 3. In the blink of an eye, more than a dozen sword lights gushed out. It was completely unreasonable, and there was no greeting at all. Just by looking at the sword lights, one could tell that this was not a spar, but a fight to the death. Lu Xiaoyi didn't know who this person was, not an assassin's identity success. At the same time, he also understood the origins of the two cultivators. They were either Supreme or Wan Jinglu. They were the real avengers who had been waiting here for their revenge. In the end, he had managed to call them out with a single shout. His T-Tess, if he wanted to, he could have slipped away and no one would have noticed. No matter how powerful the people in the sky were, they couldn't possibly care about the culprit in the crowd below in the middle of a fierce battle. His was a failure because he couldn't move his legs. He couldn't let the person protecting him face the enemy alone, while he, the mastermind of this incident, ran away without a care. Although he wanted to be a rice worm, he wanted to be a rice worm with a clear conscience. Lu Xiaoyi's heart was filled with endless complaints, all directed at the swordsman. Without a doubt, the news of him killing people had been sent back to the dome, and then the protective sect had sent out elites to protect him. As for why it was an inner sword and not an outer sword, this was still unclear. The problem was, why didn't you say something? Why are you acting so mysterious? Why are you putting on airs? Why are you acting like an expert? If he'd known earlier that it was Xuanyuan's inner sword that was tailing them, he would have had 10,000 ways to easily take care of these two magic cultivators. Seeing the three fighting fiercely in the air, with outsiders unable to interfere, Lu Xiaoyi couldn't help but complain in his heart. Even more cultivators were complaining. Those were the 5 Righteous Law cultivators and the 3 Seeking Spring cultivators. They didn't chase or run. The battle in the sky wasn't completely unrelated to them. The Righteous Law sect was the landlord. If you found a Laozi in the middle of the night, if a flying sword technique injured the mortals below, they would also be held responsible. The same logic. The 3 Seeking Spring cultivators couldn't explain it clearly. The leading Righteous Law cultivator stomped his foot. What are you still looking at? What are you standing there for? Why aren't you setting up the barrier below? If a flying sword technique falls from above, we'll have to block it. His words woke them up, and the 8 cultivators hurriedly made their preparations below, preparing to clean up the mess caused by the big sex fight. A Seeking Spring cultivator anxiously said, "That's Xuanyuan and Supreme. There's no way to stop them. Where's your Righteous Law sect, Jindan? I saw him the last time they caught me." The righteous lost sect cultivator beside him said angrily, "You're King unrepentant. Of all times to come, why did you have to come now? If it wasn't for you guys messing up the scene, we might have been able to hold them back before they attacked. Now that they've torn each other apart, how can we separate them without seeing blood?" While they were arguing, the three people in the air fought even more fiercely. The swordsman's attacks were sharp, and his movement technique was marvelous. He was slightly stronger than the two magic cultivators, but the magic cultivators had the advantage of numbers, and they were experienced. They knew that Xuan Yuan's swordsman's might would be maximized in a battle of movement. Thus, they decided to guard a space and not leave, allowing the swordsman to move around blindly like the wind. Another advantage of doing so was that the cultivators below would be busy defending the city, and there wouldn't be anyone rashly attacking. This was because this place was already vaguely within Xuan Yuan's sphere of influence, and the Righteous Law sect was definitely biased towards Xuan Yuan's sword sect. If they were to fly into the wilderness outside the city, there was no guarantee that there wouldn't be anyone who would try to stop them. They were also very puzzled. They were clearly chasing an external sword newbie, so why did they suddenly change to an internal sword expert? To them, a prolonged battle here was actually disadvantageous to them. Although magic cultivators were the most durable, this was Xuan Yuan's territory. If another swordsman passed by, the two of them might not be able to return alive. The two's divine senses clashed, and they came to a decision. They had been friends for decades, and they understood each other very well. In an instant, they found a solution that suited their characteristics. Chapter 227. Among the two supreme Taoists, one of them had learned a very special technique called the technique of string lifting. By memorizing the opponent's movements, he could form a rough map of the opponent's movements. Then, through some kind of secret technique, he could gain the ability to control the opponent's movements for a short period of time. This wasn't a secret technique that could be easily used in a battle, because it was very difficult for cultivators to divide their attention to do this during an intense battle. At least, it was very difficult for Foundation establishment cultivators to do this. However, the purpose of this secret technique was to control opponents who moved quickly so that they wouldn't gain the upper hand due to their speed. In the cultivation world, there were many techniques that could control the opponent's state, such as making them dizzy, dazzling, charming, and so on. However, these techniques belong to the category of high-level techniques. Foundation establishment cultivators had just stepped into the door of cultivation. Their so-called techniques were still the most basic techniques, such as icicles, wind blades, fire chains, earth shields with thorns, and so on. Because they didn't have enough mental power, they couldn't completely control other cultivators. However, for a big sect like the Supreme Taoists, their techniques were naturally different. There were some secret techniques that could indirectly control or influence the opponent. The technique of string lifting was such a technique. It might not be able to completely control the opponent, but it could affect the opponent's movement trajectory to a large extent. Just like a marionette in a sense, the direction it was traveling in would always deviate. If it wanted to go east, it might end up going southeast. If it wanted to go west, it might end up going northwest instead. Its body would be out of control, just like a marionette on strings. This was basically the limit of what a Foundation establishment cultivator could do. It was indeed a good way to deal with a profession like the swordsman who could move around freely. Since it had such an effect, it wasn't easy to use. After a period of battle, one would have to memorize the opponent's movements. Then, one would have to perform the secret technique without being disturbed. One person wouldn't have the opportunity to perform the secret technique. However, there were two supreme Taoists, so it was possible to perform the technique of string lifting. Their division of labor was very clear. One of them would hold back the sword cultivator for a period of time, while the other person, who had already memorized the sword cultivator's movements, would find time to complete the execution of the secret technique. If they succeeded, the swordsman would be at a loss for a short period of time, and they would have the opportunity to kill him. Even if that didn't work out, they would still be able to retreat. This was a perfect plan, if you don't consider the influence of other external factors. Of course, they didn't think that the righteous lost sex cultivators would dare to rashly interfere, not to mention those rogue cultivators. After offending a giant like Wu Shang, what good could come out of it? Several cultivators from the righteous lost sect and a few rogue cultivators were below, receiving the aftermath of the battle, but it wasn't hard for them. The three cultivators in the battle were indeed experts from large sects. Even if the battle was so intense, they were still able to control their moves and didn't directly fly towards the city below. This was the basic quality of daring to fight above a human city. However, they were still very careful. They were afraid that the moment the two sides fought to the death, a big move would be revealed. This was something they had to guard against. Of course, under such careful circumstances, they were also the first to discover that another cultivator had appeared below them. This was a strange young cultivator. On his shoulder was a strange magic tool that looked like a spike club. However, upon closer inspection, that wasn't right. It looked more like a grass target with candied haws stuck on it. Perhaps it was just a grass target, without any fluctuations of spiritual opportunity leaking out. This was also a foundation establishment cultivator. In the eyes of the righteous lost sect, this was very likely a foundation establishment cultivator who had settled down in River Luo City. Perhaps he was simply a spring seeker. It was just that those three couldn't hold themselves back and ran away at lightning speed, while this crafty old fox hid at the back and only came out now to lend a hand. No matter what, choosing to stand out at this time was worthy of recognition. It was better than hiding on the sidelines and watching the show. Find a place to stand. Don't worry about anything else. You only need to catch the flying swords and magical techniques falling from above. After this matter is over, the righteous lost sect will give you our thanks. The righteous lost sect's leader warned. Since he came up, he naturally understood the rules. That young cultivator gave them a brilliant smile, but his body didn't stop. He passed over the low altitude they were standing at and flew to an even higher battlefield. The leader was startled. Was this the tempo of wanting to join the battle? Just as he was about to shout for him to stop, he suddenly shut his mouth. It wasn't just him, but the other 7 cultivators as well. They couldn't see it when they were flying face to face, but when this young cultivator passed over them and turned his back, a sword case astonishingly appeared in everyone's eyes. This was a swordsman. Which sect swordsman was there in the vicinity? This was the precursor to a sneak attack. However, no one could say anything. You two peerless swordsmen have been fighting one for such a long time, yet you don't allow a swordsman to fight 2 against 2? A battle between Foundation establishment cultivators wouldn't be held in the air. That was because it was difficult for them to survive in such a place. In a situation like this, it was impossible for them to affect a mortal city at such a low altitude. Therefore, they had been fighting in the middle of the sky at an altitude of over 1,000 zhang. The righteous lost sect's cultivators were waiting to catch the flying swords a few hundred zhang below. In their opinion, it wouldn't be easy for an external swordsman to launch a sneak attack, because the flying swords of the inner swordsman above them were only about 300 zhang. External swords were far inferior to inner swords. This was a well-known fact. Therefore, if this person wanted to launch a sneak attack, he would have to be at least 200 zhang away from the battlefield. This position was already far away from the righteous lost sect's cultivators. With such a sudden rise, it would be difficult for the peerless cultivators to not notice. In the end, there was a high probability that it would be a 2 against 2 result. However, they were wrong. As soon as this young swordsman flew past them, he opened his mouth and shouted for a cellar. Sugar-coated haws, sour and sweet. At the same time, a flying sword slid out from the sword case, silently and slowly climbing upwards, without a trace of killing intent or power. It was like a venomous snake slowly approaching its prey. The snake didn't spit out its tongue, and its scales didn't open. All the cultivators who saw this scene felt a chill run down their spines. With such a slow speed, how high could it climb? There was still a distance of 400 zhang from the battlefield, far exceeding the swordsman's theoretical control distance. Even the inner sword's sword pellet, which was a formless and intangible flying sword, could only reach a distance of 300 jawn. How could this completely materialized flying sword maintain its lock on the target? The flying sword was still climbing, hidden in the darkness, hidden in the increasingly intense spiritual vigor explosion of the battlefield. In the cultivator's perception, if they searched with all their might, it would be impossible for such a close distance to not arouse suspicion. However, this was a battlefield. Most importantly, its target was immersed in the final crucial moment of pulling the string. In the next moment, that cultivator's magic power circulated wildly, finally completing this troublesome but very effective spell. At the same time, the white-robed swordsman suddenly felt that he had lost control of his movement, involuntarily creating a diversion. It was also at this moment that the flying sword that was about 1,000 jawn away from the battlefield suddenly trembled and shot out. Chapter 228. The sky was in chaos. The white-clothed swordsman instantly lost control. The peerless cultivator who had been gritting his teeth all this while began his counterattack. The other peerless cultivator spun and fell down, spraying out a rain of blood that was not too obvious in the dark night. Lu Xiaoyi threw the skewer of the candied haws and pulled out his sword, stabbing upwards. In his honest understanding, he had a way of responding to those who wanted to kill him. However, there was no time for him to complete his habit. The white-clothed swordsman immediately gained control of his body after the death of the peerless cultivator. In his anger, he erupted with all his strength. His opponent was originally slightly weaker than him and had already used up too much of his mana in the fight. He thought that he could wait for his comrade's help, but instead, his comrade died and another swordsman appeared. There was no way to fight this battle. He planned to forcefully escape, but at the most critical moment, he forgot the number one taboo when fighting against a swordsman. One must never show one's back to the swordsman. If he was a mentally strong cultivator, the best way would be to fight against Lu Xiaoyi, leaving life and death to fate. If he was lucky, he might be able to control this young swordsman who had only joined the sect for 3 years. If he was unlucky, he would have a scapegoat. However, he did not have the natural courage of a warrior. He was afraid, and the result was very simple. When Lu Xiaoyi rushed over, he was torn to pieces by the flying swords that filled the sky. Lu Xiaoyi bathed in the rain of blood in a daze. He took deep breaths, closed his eyes, and swayed slightly, as if he was enjoying the beauty of this moment of slaughter. The heavens took pity on him. He was just trying his best not to faint. However, the cultivators of the righteous law sect below had a different feeling. They knew that the white-clothed inner sword was stronger than this young outer sword, but they would rather face that inner sword than this perverted outer sword. The ridiculousness of carrying the candied haws, the flying swords that were like venomous snakes, the cruelty of breathing in the rain of blood, all of these painted him with a layer of bloody commentary. Even the white-clothed swordsman could not bear to watch any longer, and shouted, "Hey, even if you like to drink human blood, please find a place where there is no one around." Acting so unscrupulously in public, it makes our Xian Yuan seem like a demonic sect. Lu Xiaoyi opened his eyes and weakly began his explanation that no one would accept. "I'm dizzy." The white-clothed swordsman snorted, as if he was dissatisfied with this clumsy lie. So what if he liked the smell of blood? There were tens of thousands of swordsmen in Xian Yuan. How many of them did not like the smell of blood? Why did he have to use such a lie? Let's go. What are you still standing here for? It'll be troublesome when the elders of the righteous law sect arrive. Lu Xiaoyi looked regretfully at the candied haws that were falling to the ground. He was somewhat reluctant to part with them. It was not because he wanted to pretend, but because he suddenly felt that the sweet and sour taste of the candied haws after killing someone would greatly reduce his discomfort. Yes, when he went out to do business in the future, he must bring more of this stuff with him in his storage ring, so that he could recover as quickly as possible. His thoughts were completely based on his own state, but he had never thought of how perverted it would be to lick a piece of sugar-coated hawthorn in the midst of blood after killing someone. This would bring him a nickname that he would never be able to erase in this lifetime. And all of this originated from a coincidence in River Luo City. Lu Xiaoyi flew in front, and soon he felt that faintly discernible divine sense behind him, which made him feel very uncomfortable. The swordsman's arrogance was already carved into their bones. It was as if knowing a foreign swordsman was a disgrace to them. Can't they act like a normal person? Let's meet, have a drink, be friends, and help each other out if there's anything. Is there need to act all high and mighty? What was originally an easy mission became dangerous because of the swordsman's arrogance. After the mission, he still did not wake up and was still as arrogant as before. Although Lu Xiaoyi was saved, he did not feel much gratitude. He also saved that guy once, so they were even. When he really matured one day, he would find a chance to let this guy know the power of an external sword. He was filled with resentment, and the white swordsman behind him was also unhappy. He originally thought that this was an extremely simple mission for the sect. An external sword newbie had caused trouble outside and killed someone, and the sect had secretly received the news. As a precaution, they notified the nearby swordsmen to pay attention to this person's whereabouts. If they found him, they were to protect him and return to the mountain. He was lucky to have bumped into this person. He liked to fight, but he did not like to protect others. This was a waste of his precious time, but since he had encountered this person, he would resolutely complete the mission given by the sect. But from what he understood, there were many ways to complete the mission. The worst way was to appear beside the newbie and scare away all those who were plotting against him. The protection would be completed smoothly, but it was meaningless to him. From his point of view, the safety of a newbie was not important. What was important was those who dared to extend their claws in the western regions. Losing a small swordsman was normal, but if they could break the hands that dared to extend their claws, it would be more in line with Xuanyuan's interests. That would save more Xianyuan disciples. This was his understanding. It had to be said that internal swordsmen were always very confident. So confident that even the orders given by the sect were mixed with their own judgment. He was not worried. Familiar with Xuanyuan's internal affairs, he knew that the order must have been given by the sword qi rushing to the heavens. But he was under the control of Wen Guangfeng's chaotic Thunder Palace. Even if the newbie lost his life in the end, and he cut off the hands of an external power, at least in the Thunder Palace, he would receive unreserved support. This was the reason why he had been hanging at the back without going forward to acknowledge him. He did not treat the person in front as a target to protect, but as a bait. As long as he caught the big fish, what did it matter if the bait was lost or not? But the process of the matter made him suffer the pain of worry. This newbie was so troublesome, making the originally easy tracking extremely difficult. It was not that he had not done similar tracking and protection missions. To him, for a small swordsman who had only joined the sect for 3 years, he could easily complete the mission with one hand. The other party would be in a daze throughout the entire process, not knowing anything. But this person was extremely troublesome. He seemed to have realized that he was being followed, so he tried to escape in every possible way, using all kinds of tricks. There were several times when he almost fell into the newbie's trap. This made him vexed, but also made him stubborn. He wanted to see if this newbie could dig him out. Reality proved that he had failed. Chapter 229. With his cunning, the rookie had dug a hole for everyone in Halua City. It was a simple method, but the effect was obvious. He didn't miss anything. He had finally caught 2 claws that had reached into the western region. However, it wasn't under his initiative, but a passive participation. What was worse was that he didn't do his best in this operation. Not only did the rookie take half of the credit, he even owed him a favor. This made him feel very unhappy. He didn't think that without the rookie's help, he would definitely be defeated. There was a high probability that he would be able to escape with his 2 claws. But the truth was the truth. This time, at least half of the credit belonged to the rookie. Luring the enemy and killing the enemy, There was nothing to say. Yes, as proud as he didn't think that the rookie owed him a favor. This was just a mission, nothing more. But in the middle of a mission, he owed the rookie a favor. This was intolerable. An elite swordsman owed an external sword rookie a favor. It was unimaginable. He didn't like this rookie, not at all. From the beginning, he had this attitude. There were too many reasons. The rookie didn't ride the sword. You're a swordsman, but you don't use the swordsman's way to travel. Are you still a swordsman? The rookie was too cunning. His thoughts were all on the crooked path. He caused countless troubles along the way, causing him to use all his skills. The rookie was very timid. He knew that there might be a supreme cultivator chasing after him, but he didn't dare to walk in a straight line. Instead, he turned back in a curve. He couldn't hide his fear of death. The rookie loved to sneak attack. You're a Xianyuan swordsman. Even if you're an external sword, can't you use your sword in a straightforward manner? Why did you have to take advantage of the fact that the rookie had just completed his secret technique and was weak? The rookie was too perverted. Liking to see blood was one thing. Indulging in it was another. Was this something that a normal person would do? The rookie wasn't honest. He was obviously a pervert, but he said that he was scared of blood. Did he take him for a fool? Rookie. He didn't like rookies, but that didn't mean he would reject the mission. These were two different things. In the Xianyuan sword school, there was a deep-rooted belief that the inner sword was the true guardian of Xianyuan, while the outer sword was just a lackey. The fact that a small fry had stolen the limelight of an elite was the reason why he was unhappy, although he might not be aware of it. He still hoped that there would be a second wave of clawing hands to prove his ability, but he was obviously overthinking. Within 1 or 2 months of the dome, he could already see a few swordsmen flying through the air. This was already Xuanyuan's world. In the unwritten rules of the Fifth Ring, if an external force entered the territory of the Fifth Ring, it was not necessary to kill them on sight. Instead, it was necessary to distinguish them by flying height. For example, for a Foundation Establishment cultivator, if a Supreme or 3 Pure Ones cultivator came here, they could either run on the ground and no one would find trouble with them, or fly at a height of 5,000 feet. This was a sign of respect for the master. At most, a swordsman would come over to ask, but they wouldn't directly attack. If a Foundation Establishment cultivator directly swaggered through the air, there would definitely be a flying sword coming over to greet them. As for how they would continue, that was another matter altogether. This was the case for cultivators in Xianyuan territory. If a swordsman went to the southeast region or the air-sea region, it was the same in the territories of the Supreme and 3 Pure Ones. A powerful dragon could not defeat a snake in its own territory. After a month or so away from the dome, the swordsman's flying sword could be seen every day. He finally didn't have to worry about the rookie anymore. He shook his body and left on his own. On the other hand, Lu Xiaoyi continued at his own pace. Originally, he wanted to use this opportunity to explore the mortal world more. Since other places were dangerous, there shouldn't be any problems in the area under the influence of the Xianyuan sword sect, right? Just the area under the influence of the dome for 2 months was enough for him to travel for a few years. However, because of the sword spirit, he had to return to the mountain. Only when he returned could he buy the materials to continue his countless guesses. Previously, he didn't have much interest in swordsmanship because no matter how good he was at external swordsmanship, he was nothing more than a lackey in the eyes of the inner sword sect in white. But now he saw a different hope. At the very least, in just a few months, the distance he could control with the 4 Seasons flying sword had surpassed the proud and arrogant inner swordsman. This was unimaginable and filled him with hope. When he finally saw the snowy peaks of the dome that reached the clouds, he couldn't help but sigh. He also heaved a sigh of relief. He, who had only been in the sect for 3 years, didn't have much of a sense of belonging to the sect and didn't feel like he was going home. But there was one thing, a feeling of relief in his heart. No matter what, it was a reliable place to stay. And when he was in danger, the sect didn't hesitate to lend a helping hand, although that guy wasn't very reliable. Just like how he had left quietly, now he was returning quietly. No one knew, and no one cared. Therefore, no one waited for him. It was just like how he had stayed in the colorful world under the snow-capped peak for a period of time. He wasn't a vain person, and he didn't want Xian Yuan to welcome him home with a grand welcome. However, he was still disappointed that Xian Yuan was going to welcome him home in such a gloomy manner. At the very least, he had killed 4 people. Was that something that anyone could do? It could also be 3. He just didn't know what the Inner Sword sect in white would say when he returned. He didn't care. It would be best if someone took the initiative to shoulder all the troubles he caused outside. Wasn't Xian Yuan happy to hear about the battle? Let them be happy. He just wanted to live his life well and not be bullied by others. When he returned to his cave, everything was normal. This was the good thing about the snowy mountain. It was so clean that it seemed as if there wasn't a speck of dust, as if it wasn't in the mortal world. But before he could decide on the next step of his cultivation, a warning appeared on the sword talisman. It was a notification from the visit hall that he had to end the mission. He forgot. Every time a Foundation establishment cultivator completed a mission, they would go to the visit hall to cancel the mission and report the process of the mission. But the most important thing was, who did they kill during the mission? Which sect did they belong to? What was the reason? The sect needed to know this, not to punish them, but to help the upper echelons make decisions for the future of the sect. From the encounters of these small Foundation establishment cultivators outside, they could roughly determine which powers were friendly to Xian Yuan and which ones were full of malice. Lu Xiaoyi had no choice but to return 1,000 Elegance Peak. He hurriedly filled up a letter slip in the side hall where he received missions. He was vague about his actions, only saying that there was a conflict and that 3 people were killed in Min Province, but he didn't mention the truth of what happened afterwards. His thought was, I'll just treat it as letting that Inner Sword sect fellow off easy. What's the difference between 3 and 4? Chapter 230. The disciple on duty didn't make things difficult for him. Every day, there were many Foundation establishment disciples handing in missions here, so he didn't have the time to carefully examine these details. There were people in the sect who did these things, so he didn't need to worry. He handed 5 spirit stones to him. Junior brother Cigarette, but you haven't seen Martial Uncle Ascension Hall for a long time, right? Martial Uncle Gu Gang is waiting for you in the main hall. Lu Xiaoyi was a bit puzzled. It wasn't that he didn't want to see the Ascension Hall masters. Before leaving the mountain, he wanted to understand the specific situation of Senior Brother Gu Bei's mission through them. But the martial uncles were avoiding him. Now that he arrived at the Ascension Hall, he still needed to line up. The Foundation establishment external swords entered one by one in an orderly manner. Each of them had their own troubles, such as accidentally injuring fellow disciples while exchanging pointers, entangling neighbors, dissatisfaction with the allocation of resources, unclear apprenticeship procedures, excessive participation in small groups, bullying and tyrannizing mortal relatives at the foot of Cheongding Mountain, and so on. There were countless unexpected troubles. Tens of thousands of Foundation establishment external swords were all handled by the Ascension Hall, a primary management hall. Even for the limited number of Jean Dan martial uncles, this wasn't an easy job. Lu Xiaoyi faintly felt that the position of resources wasn't necessarily a good thing for cultivators. Not to mention how much power and benefits there were, it had a huge impact on one's cultivation. He didn't know why the Jean Dan martial uncles were happy to be here. This had nothing to do with him. It was just a thought he had while waiting. Soon, it was his turn. When he walked into the hall, only Gu Gang was there. His expression was normal, but his eyes were a bit tired. When he saw Lu Xiaoyi come in, he didn't say much and threw a storage ring to him. There are 400 mid-grade spirit stones in here. It's a reward for completing the mission and killing tens of thousands of Jing Lu cultivators. You have to remember that the sect doesn't encourage you to casually attack cultivators from other sections. Of course, you can't be vulgar and lose face for Xian Yuan. In short, don't lose face. Your performance, whether in Min Province Prefecture or Halua City, has been clearly recorded. What's yours will definitely be yours. No one will wrong you. Is there anything else? If there's nothing else, you can leave. Lu Xiaoyi was still a little confused. Did they not want to hear his explanation when they called him here? However, it wasn't bad either. Another prophet. That white shirt inner sword didn't seem to be hiding his head. I can go easy on him when I teach him a lesson in the future. He took the storage ring and scanned it with his divine sense. There were 400 middle-grade spirit stones neatly arranged inside. He wasn't too clear about the amount of rewards and punishments Xianyuan gave to their disciples for killing cultivators from other forces. Was this given normally, or had it been docked? A reasonable reward and punishment procedure should be clearly organized and clear. There should be someone to make the decision, and there should also be an accountant and cashier to manage the accounts. There should also be a receipt left behind. Like this, who would know if Gu Gang had given it or not? Did Lu Xiaoyi accept it? It was hard to believe that a large sect that had existed for tens of thousands of years would be so crude in such details. But of course, he wouldn't say such things out loud. Since they were silently giving it to him, he would silently take it. There was no need to talk nonsense. His current strength and status didn't allow him to raise any doubts. Thus, he put the storage ring on his finger, but was stopped by Gu Gang. Take the spirit stones, but leave the storage ring behind. If everyone was like you, I would lose 8 or 10 storage rings in a day. Sooner or later, I would have to sell my pants. Lu Xiaoyi embarrassedly took out the spirit stones and put down the storage ring. He was actually a little hesitant. According to his previous life's experience, he should take out some spirit stones to show respect to his martial uncle. Only then would he be able to obtain some benefits in the future, but at least he wouldn't be bullied. However, his 4 years of cultivation experience in Xianyuan made him restrain his thoughts of bribery. What was the cultivation world like? What was the atmosphere of the fifth ring? What was the tradition of Xianyuan's sword sect? He still needed to see it clearly. Seeing Lu Xiaoyi leave the Ascension Hall without a word, Gu Gang sighed. He was in charge of the daily affairs of low-level external sword cultivators, so he was very familiar with the specific matters of Xianyuan external sword cultivators. He knew that the sect's treatment of this little swordsman was unfair. Although there were no clear rules, and it was impossible to write such things in the sect's rules for managers like them, killing cultivators from other sects outside of the sect was rewarded. Moreover, the amount of reward varied depending on the opponent. The basic amount was 100 mid-grade spirit stones. In low-level cultivation planets, mid-grade spirit stones were very rare. However, on high-level cultivation planets, mid-grade spirit stones were very common. Of course, the price was not something that low-level cultivation planets could compare to. The so-called basic quota referred to the reward for killing rogue cultivators from small sects and clans. However, such a reward could not be obtained just by killing them. The factor of indiscriminate killing would be taken into consideration. The Xianyuan sword cultivators were easy to kill, but they could not kill indiscriminately, especially against the majority of low-level cultivators. If they killed too many, it would be harmful to the harmony of heaven and earth, and it would also damage their reputation. However, if they killed cultivators from mid-level cultivation sects, they wouldn't be able to kill indiscriminately. That was because mid-level cultivation sects already had a considerable amount of power. In terms of external sword cultivators, they didn't have much of an advantage. Defeating them was easy, but killing them was difficult. If they could obtain such a reward, they would be rewarded with 200 mid-grade spirit stones for each kill. The highest reward was to kill the disciples of the top sections. In the fifth ring, there were more than 10 sects like Supreme, Three Pure, Garan, Myriad Scenery, Spirit Gourd Cave, Chimanduanjia, and so on. Killing one of them would be rewarded with 500 mid-grade spirit stones. However, this was also the most difficult. Internal swordsmen had a very limited advantage over the disciples of these sections. Even the top genius cultivators were not weaker than internal swordsmen. If this was the case for internal swordsmen, there was no need to mention the external swordsmen. They were actually at a disadvantage when facing these disciples of the top sections. It was very difficult to kill them. Therefore, no one in the external swordsmen would use this as a way to get rich. If they made a mistake, they might even lose their lives. If they were lucky enough to obtain a reward, they would be targeted by the disciples of the other sects. Could it be that they would continue to hide in the dome? The killing game was ultimately an arena for a very small number of geniuses. Not everyone could participate in it. Because of this, Liu Xiaoyi's 4 kills in one go was already very shocking. This would be widely publicized by the Sword Chi Rushing Heaven Pavilion and be taken as a role model. However, the order Gu Gang received was to keep a low profile. No publicity, no rewards, no encouragement, no support. Therefore, he used such an irregular method to give Liu Xiaoyi the most basic reward. He did not want more people to know. Otherwise, if word got out, how could he only be rewarded with 400 mid-grade spirit stones for killing 4 disciples of the top sects, 3 supreme, and 1 myriad scenery? The sect was unfair, and so on and so forth, of course. Gu Gang also felt that this was very unfair. However, he did not know why the higher-ups would give such an order. He didn't even know which martial uncle had given such an order. From his point of view, this little swordsman had offended some big shot, which was why he was being suppressed like this. Xin Yuan strictly forbade internal strife within the sect, but if it involved the upper echelons, what could he do? Chapter 231. Liu Xiaoyi did not understand the intricacies of this, nor did he understand the unspoken rules of Xin Yuan. One had to be an old swordsman with decades of experience, or an old swordsman who was proficient in battle, to understand the intricacies of this. For the various large sects, open and covert struggles between the lower-level cultivators were acceptable and even necessary, but it could not be promoted to the extent of being encouraged by the sect rules. It cannot be done on paper. After all, this was a form of training, not a war. No one had told Liu Xiaoyi about this, and even he had kept it to himself. Thus, 400 mid-grade spirit stones was a profit to him, and he was extremely happy. His current net worth was close to 1,000 mid-grade spirit stones. It was enough to support his research for a period of time, and that was the most important thing. But now, the first thing he had to do was to distribute his wealth. He had to pay off the 3,000 spirit stones that Gu Bei owed him. There were 2 ways to do this. The first was to visit them one by one. The advantage of this was that he would get to know many people, and they would be grateful to him, and he could become friends with them. This was very beneficial to his cultivation life in the dome. The disadvantage was that it was a waste of time. Gu Bei did not borrow much from each person, only around 100 spirit stones. This meant that he would have to travel dozens of times. Furthermore, not everyone would stay in the cave residence. There would always be people who went out for various reasons and did not return for many years. This would cause him a headache. The other way was to entrust this task to the side hall of the visitation hall. The advantage was that it would be done in an instant, and he would not have to worry about it. The disadvantage was that he would not be able to meet the creditors, and they would naturally not be grateful. At most, they would think that Gu Bei was good in their hearts. He was a lazy person, so his choice was very natural. He would just throw it to the visitation hall and be done with it. From his point of view, when you had the strength, there would naturally be many people who would want to befriend you. If you did not have the strength, what was the use of sending spirit stones? However, it was just a word of thanks, and it was the kind that would be forgotten after saying it. Since he had come to Thousand Elegance Peak, he might as well go to the market and Bo Ao Loft to take a look. He needed to prepare some materials and sword techniques to verify his conjecture. This was his current priority. In the Sword Ao Loft, Liu Xiaoyi did not hesitate this time. He directly took out a sword technique book, 10 Strikes. It was not his choice, but Gu Bei's choice. Gu Bei had left behind 3 sword embryos among his belongings. They were all top-notch materials for flying swords. Gu Bei had collected them all his life. Just like how people who like to drink like to collect wine bottles, 9 out of 10 people who played with flying swords like to collect sword embryos. In Gu Bei's dream, each of the 3 sword embryos had its own sword skill combination, and they were all top sword skills of the 10th level. It was not that Gu Bei's strength had reached that level, but since it was just a dream, why not make it more perfect? These sword embryos were hidden by Gu Bei for his ideals. If his cultivation progressed smoothly, there was a possibility that he could personally practice them. However, That would mean that he would have to spend a great amount of money on this path, as those expensive and rare materials would have to repeat themselves after repeated failures. However, the heavens did not give him such an opportunity in the end. After he was over 100 years old, he had no choice but to put more effort into breaking through to the upper realm. Between longevity and sword skills, he still succumbed to fate and chose the direction of a longer life. However, fate played with him. In the end, his dream of sword skills and longevity both became nothing. This was actually the problem that most Foundation establishment swordsmen faced. Should they ignore longevity and focus on the sword, and use it to break through to the upper realm while they were at it? Or should they focus on longevity instead of the sword, and wait until they had a longer lifespan before seeking a breakthrough in sword skills? Both of them were reasonable and unreasonable at the same time, because most cultivators would end up with nothing in the end. The three sword embryos all had their own sword skills. This was the result of Gu Bei's meticulous selection over the past 100 years. He had considered all aspects. Even if he could not put it into action, he could at least use it for his own entertainment when he was bored. To Lu Xiaoyi, it was fine as long as he followed his heart. Firstly, it would save him a lot of trouble, and secondly, it could be considered as helping Gu Bei fulfill his unfulfilled wish. The three sword embryos corresponded to three sets of sword skills. Lu Xiaoyi still had 2 rights to choose from the sword skills. In the end, he chose the 10 moves decisive city. This was because this was a set of sword skills that focused on pure strength, and there were not many attributes to choose from. Furthermore, he was a lazy person. He did not stay in the Sword Turtle Tower for long, and went straight to the market. Other than purchasing the materials for the 10 moves decisive city sword formation, he also purchased 2 ordinary sword embryos and some materials for the 4 season sword song. He needed to refine another 4 seasons flying sword, and then see under what circumstances a sword spirit would be born. Actually, these 2 flying swords were the targets of his experiments, but they were different paths. Refining a flying sword was not the goal, but refining a sword spirit was the key. This purchase cost him close to 500 mid-grade spirit stones, mainly on the materials for the 10 moves decisive city. This was only the cost of the materials for the first few levels of the 10 moves decisive city. If he added the materials for the later levels and the repeated failures after repeated failures, the cost would be huge. This was why the 9th and 10th levels of sword skills were so hard to come by, but not many people actually tried it. It could really empty your savings of decades and put you in a difficult position between refining a sword and immortality. Lu Xiaoyi did not need to consider so much for the time being. He was far from having to choose between immortality and sword skills. The 10 moves decisive city could extend the sword skills by 10 levels. 10 levels meant that a Foundation establishment cultivator could inscribe 10 levels of the decisive city sword formation on the sword embryos. Extension meant that after a cultivator reached the level of Jin Dan, he could continue to inscribe sword formations on this foundation, reaching 20 levels, 30 levels, or even more. There was no need to throw in a flying sword for every level. Of course, if you felt that the recording of the Foundation establishment moment was not perfect enough, and you had enough resources, then you could start from scratch to refine a flying sword again. This time, Lu Xiaoyi bought the material for the first 5 levels of the 10 moves decisive city. He did not dare to buy the rest, because he did not have enough spirit stones. Even so, it was hard to say if the materials he bought would be enough for him to complete the 5th level. His main goal was still to find the birth of a sword spirit, and refining the 10 moves decisive city was secondary. The sword formation was called the Blood Formation of Dang City. It was a sword formation that could be upgraded layer by layer, and it would get more complicated as it progressed. Lu Xiaoyi could be considered to have some experience in sword formations, and this allowed him to easily complete the first 3 levels in one go. Then he was suddenly stuck on the 4th level, and was at his wit's end. Even if his magic power was stable enough and his spirit strong enough, he still lacked something, and he could not succeed. He was not in a hurry. If he could not complete the 10 moves decisive city, Then he would use the sword song of 4 seasons that he was familiar with. He was familiar with the process, and he completed it in a few days. Then he would turn to the 10 moves decisive city and continue to fail. He finally discovered his shortcoming. His talent in sword formations was really very limited. The 4th level was already so difficult, and there were still 6 levels after that. This was practically an impossible task. Chapter 232. On the snowy plains below Thousand Elegance Peak, there was a huge river of ice. The river of ice twisted and turned, forming a beautiful scenery on the snowy plains. There were many who built their cave dwellings using the river of ice, but the further west one went, the fewer there were. Because the river was too flat, the cave dwellings were not caves, and people were not insects. It was impossible to dig a hole on a small hill, but there were also those who had unique interests. A snow mound that was dozens of feet high, a simple cave dwelling, and a human figure running across the vast snowy plains formed a beautiful scene of nature. Amidst the ordinary calmness, there was a sense of harmony. Lu Xiaoyi had now successfully combined several cultivation techniques together. The Big Dipper scripture, purple star body, starlight traction, astral observation. The result of this was not only to save time, it was also a process of mutual promotion and complementation. The effect of 1 + 1 was greater than 2. This was not an ability that an ordinary person could easily possess. It was a skill that his soul had cultivated after drifting in the universe for countless years. He did not have a comprehensive plan for the cultivation technique system because he did not have a comprehensive plan for his own future. In his opinion, a mere foundation establishment cultivator's understanding of the world, the great Tao, and the nature were all at the most basic stage. If you did not understand anything, what right do you have to plan for your future? Because he had saved a lot of time on the cultivation technique, he had more time to hone his swordsmanship. The target of his training was the 4 seasons flying sword that had already produced a sword spirit. This was a very natural choice. Any flying sword would have a sword spirit at the top, followed by layers. With a sword spirit, there would be endless possibilities. Without a sword spirit, it would still be an ordinary piece of metal. On the way back to the mountain, Lu Xiaoyi discovered a strange phenomenon. When a flying sword produced a sword spirit, it was less reliant on the layers of the sword formation. In other words, the 4 seasons flying sword now relied on the connection between the sword spirit and the human. This connection encompassed a wide range of things. It was not only the exchange of souls, but also the exchange of transcendence energy. It was not to say that a flying sword that produced a sword spirit was cultivated by a human cultivator. It could reach the limit of a flying sword. The sword spirit also needed to grow. The growth of a sword spirit in a sword case was very limited. More importantly, it was used to train the sword. Using the sword again and again, it nourished the growth of the flying sword and strengthened the body of the sword spirit. Only when the body of the sword spirit was strengthened could Lu Xiaoyi channel more transcendence energy and soul into it, allowing the flying sword to display a greater power. These were the 2 ways to increase the power of a flying sword. One was through the layers of the sword formation, and the other was through the strengthening of the sword spirit. The higher the level of the cultivator, the more important the sword spirit was. Lu Xiaoyi could not achieve a breakthrough in the layers of the sword formation, so he could only work on the strengthening of the sword spirit. In theory, the growth of the swordsman's flying sword was as follows. Foundation establishment was purely based on the layers of the sword formation, because they did not have a sword spirit. Jin Dan was still mainly based on the layers of the sword formation, but there might be a few lucky ones who had a sword spirit. Yuan Ying was gradually beginning to produce a sword spirit. Perfected lords all had a sword spirit in their flying sword, because without a sword spirit, a Yuan Ying could not become a lord. It was inconceivable that Lu Xiaoyi could have a sword spirit in his current foundation establishment stage. If he had an average standard in the inscription of sword formations, then his strength would soon be outstanding among the swordsmen. However, his inscription of sword formations was not good enough, so everything was still unknown. He would soon stand out among the newbies in the foundation establishment stage. But compared to the old swordsman, there would still be a large gap. This was because the old swordsman had more flying swords, unless he could solve the problem of the spirit of the flying sword. But now, it seemed that he had no clue. His cultivation continued smoothly and bumpily. The bumpy part was the formation of the sword spirit and the inscription of the sword formation, but everything else was considered smooth. He was not sure what kind of state he was in among the newbies in the foundation establishment stage, but it shouldn't be slow, right? Time slowly flowed by in his selfless cultivation. The newbies in the swordsman's sects developed in various ways, but most of them were active in the snowy dome and the surrounding 2 months. There were very few people like Lu Xiaoyi who went out, because the old swordsman would tell them that although the swordsman's achievements in the fifth ring were unparalleled, they had also become the target of many powerful sections. Hunting was mutual, and swordsman was not always the hunter. Sometimes they were the prey. Lu Xiaoyi was the only one who acted on his own initiative and went out after only 3 years of training. If he had made enough friends and met more senior swordsmen, he would not have been so impulsive. Boa Tower, Visitation Hall, Market Square, Dharma Lectures, and Immortal's Cave. These were the daily routines of most newbies. After 10 years of training like this, most cultivators would smoothly reach the foundation establishment stage and have some achievements in swordsmanship. At the very least, they would be able to master a flying sword, which was the most basic requirement for traveling. Swordsman was a profession that would not be successful if it was confined to the mountain. There was also no point in fighting with fellow disciples all day long. In a swordsman's life, the most powerful opponents he met were all Dharma cultivators. If he did not come into contact with them, fight them, and fumble around in life and death situations, he would not be able to improve. Therefore, 10 years was the approximate dividing line. Fledgling swordsmen began to break away from the protection of the sect and went out to start their own new journey. Of course, there were also those who were timid, but in the great melting pot of Xianyuan, timid people often found it difficult to achieve great things, because the heart of the sword was not there. Casualties often occurred at this stage. Every year, about 100 or so people died, and many of them were caused by these young eagles that flew out. The sect was well aware of this, but they could not forever enclose them in the nest because of casualties. This was a loss that had to be borne. After going out once, Lu Xiaoyi had obediently stayed in the mountain gate. He did not care about the heart of the sword. He had no choice but to kill 4 people during the last long journey. He wanted to complete his repayment to Senior Gu Bei, but if he wanted him to deliberately go out and find danger to temper himself, he would not have such radical thoughts. Therefore, when he was summoned by the Visitation Hall sword talisman, he was very unwilling. Cultivators have to accept missions from the sect after 10 years in the dome. This is unreasonable, right? My cultivation is slower than others. Who isn't a baby? The senior brother in charge of issuing missions was somewhat impatient. He had seen swordsmen timid before, but he had never seen a timid one so openly. Xianyuan does not raise giant babies. This is the sect's rule, and no one could change it. Lu Xiaoyi was still unwilling to give up. 7 years ago, which was 3 years after I entered the sect, I went on a long journey. I was half a year away from the dome. Is that far enough? Can it be considered as a long-distance mission? The senior brother looked at him disdainfully. You ate yesterday, so you don't have to eat today? You took a dump the day before yesterday, so you don't have to take a dump today? You watered your family's plot of land 7 years ago, so you can always be idle after that? Chapter 233. P.S. Yoyu-chan is studying hard. I don't know if she can see it. Lu Xiaoyi's character cartoon is her masterpiece. Everyone bless her. Also, use your monthly ticket to exchange for her contact information. This senior brother was sharp-tongued, but Lu Xiaoyi was not angry. He was still a little unwilling to give up. Is there no alternative? As long as I can stay in the dome and not go out? He really did not want to go out. His current cultivation state was just right. He had just entered the middle stage of foundation establishment last year. The power of the four-season sword had greatly improved, his spirit was exceptionally strong, and his celestial escape was more elegant and mysterious. He was in the ascending stage of cultivation and had not encountered any bottlenecks. He should work hard at this pace. He did not want to go out and waste time. The senior brother in charge of the mission was really annoyed. Xuan Yuan's missions are never forced to be completed by cultivators. There's always a second path for you to choose. How about this? If you participate in the sect competition that is held once every 10 years, you can stay in the sect. Lu Xiaoyi immediately became vigilant. Sect competition? Fighting with senior brothers who had practiced swordsmanship for decades, or even centuries. What's the point? Other than being abused, what else can I do? One ignorant country bumpkin, the senior brother explained. Of course we can't let you newbies compete with the seniors. You want to compete, but the seniors won't give you face. It's a competition between newbies. It's limited to those who have been in the sect for more than 10 years and less than 20 years. It's like meeting a match, a general meeting of talent. Lu Xiaoyi felt that this event was not bad. If everyone was a newbie, he should be able to handle it easily, right? The key was that the sect did not allow deathmatch, so safety was guaranteed. If that's the case, I'll participate in the sect competition. Really? Really? Then sign your name on this paper. I want to remind you that once you put pen to paper, you can't go back on your words. Lu Xiaoyi thought that such an internal competition would definitely be for the best of the external swordsmen. If they did not have roots in the sect, then they had to come from Zhuozhou. Therefore, this senior brother did not think highly of him, a wild cultivator who had been abducted from another sect, who had no backing and no background. However, he was still confident in himself. At the very least, both of them had cultivated for more than 10 years. Who was afraid of who? Thus, he signed the document without hesitation. When he was about to walk out, his senior brother's malicious voice came from behind him. Oh, I forgot to tell you. This time, it's the outer sword versus inner sword. Let's wait for the news from the Ascension Hall. I hope that Junior Brother Cigarette but can bring glory to our external sword sect. I, your senior brother, will be waiting for your glorious return. Lu Xiaoyi almost tripped at the door. This senior brother is too evil. He had said everything except for the identity of the most important opponent. No wonder most of the external swordsmen would rather venture into the outside world than stay in the mountain gate to participate in the sword duels. There was a reason. It was indeed risky to venture outside, but it was still manageable. If you were afraid of death, you could crawl on the ground. Crawling on the ground would prevent other cultivators from attacking you. It was like hanging a sign to avoid fighting. Or flying at a low altitude was also a sign of weakness. Not attacking cultivators who showed weakness was also a norm. It wasn't that there was a rule restricting you, but it came from the persistence in every cultivator's heart towards the Tao. To put it simply, cultivators were the upgraded version of the chivalrous and righteous spirit that every youth had when they were young. Different from the people in the mortal world, cultivators paid more attention to the construction and maintenance of their mental path. This was not an imaginary thing, but an important factor that would really affect their longevity in the upper realm in the future. Therefore, there was no rule, but there was indeed such a promise in every cultivator's heart. Challenge the strong and help the weak. A cultivator's self-cultivation. After all, the Fifth Ring realm wasn't in an extreme state of war, so cultivators could still control their own state of life. Of course, it was still the same saying. If you were a coward, you would lose your sword heart. That would be a lack of confidence in your own strength and sword Tao. It would be safe, but it wouldn't be beneficial to cultivation. If you walk sideways, you would have a clear sword heart. However, you would have to pay an additional price for this clarity. The reason why Lu Xiaoyi wasn't willing to go to the outside world was that he didn't want to lose his sword heart. He also didn't want to walk sideways and lose his life. Thus, he might as well stay at home and not leave. However, if the price of staying at the mountain gate was to fight against those freaks of the inner sword, then he might as well walk sideways. At least he could still enjoy the scenery. If he walked sideways, he would slowly lose his sword heart. If he fought against the inner swordsman, his sword heart would be tortured. In the end, it was hard to say whether his sword heart would still be there, although he didn't deliberately inquire about it. He could understand the internal situation of Xian Yuan from the occasional meetings with his own small group of lowly people and from the idle chats of the teacher's lectures. The inner sword and outer sword were almost completely separated. The inner sword was arrogant and had the attitude of being in charge, while the outer sword had long since tacitly accepted this position. They had fought for it for tens of thousands of years, but had never fought for it. Instead, they were suppressed more and more to death. Thus, they adopted the current method. You're strong, aren't you? I won't fight with you. Let's adopt a non-violent and non-cooperative attitude. I can't afford to offend you, but can't I just hide? This was the general mentality of the middle and lower level cultivators in Xianyuan. The higher-ups saw it clearly and knew that if this continued, it would be detrimental to the whole of Xianyuan. Thus, the Sword Chi Rushing Heaven Pavilion contacted the Chaotic Thunder Palace and joined forces to promote the battle between the two great sword vein at the Foundation establishment and Jindan level. They also set up generous rewards for this. These measures were only one of the many efforts made by the higher-ups of Xianyuan to integrate the inner and outer swordsmen. This was because there was no danger of life within the sect. If the opponent was another large sect, then the swordsmen sent out would definitely be a combination of the inner and outer swordsmen. In Xianyuan, this was the correct way to cultivate. Just like when Lu Xiaoyi was being chased, the person who saved him would definitely be the inner sword, because this was the decree of the Thunder Palace. If an inner sword was in danger, then the person who went would definitely be the outer sword, appointed by the Rushing Heaven Pavilion. Of course, because of their battle strength, they would definitely send out a group of them. Who asked them to have so many outer swordsmen? This was the integration measure that the higher-ups of Xianyuan were trying their best to do. Although it couldn't change the foundation, at least it allowed the inner and outer swordsmen to interact with each other for tens of thousands of years. The old swordsmen understood this, but only a rice worm like Lu Xiaoyi didn't understand. In the collision between the outer swordsman and the inner sword, there might be friendships, but there might also be people whose sword heart was destroyed. There was no perfect situation in this world. To the iron-willed Xianyuan, if you started to give up on yourself during this process, it would only mean that you weren't suited to be a swordsman. It would be better for you to make a decision early. You could either develop your own Tao, such as the Tao of pills, Tao of formations, Tao of talismans, or go to a small town near the dome. It would be better for you to stay here and waste your resources. Under such circumstances, those who dared to stand out and challenge the inner swordsmen were the cream of the crop among the outer swordsmen. They were the most ambitious ones. Those who didn't think they were outstanding wouldn't participate in this kind of competition. Of course, there were exceptions. For example, people like Lu Xiaoyi who wanted to hide and relax, but didn't understand the situation of the outer swordsmen. They might not necessarily fight when they went out, but if they stayed in the sect, they would definitely fight. Moreover, it was the inner swordsman group that made the outer swordsman's face pale. Wasn't this just looking for trouble for himself? Chapter 234. Lu Xiaoyi wasn't sure how bad the internal and external swordsman's collision would be. Was it a bloody nose or a swollen face? Or was it a serious injury? This was one of the advantages of being in a big sect. As long as he didn't die on the spot, you could always be saved. But even if the physical injuries could be saved, what about the psychological trauma? He could only bear it himself. If he could walk out of it, there would be a new world. If he couldn't, then everything would be over. In these 10 years, his methods were basically no different from when he first came out of the dome 7 years ago. The only difference was in the 10 swords execution. However, he had only reached the 5th level of this set of 10 levels of swordsmanship. His inferior skill in formations was undoubtedly exposed. In terms of the power of the sword formation, of course, it was better than the 4-season swordsmanship. However, if one considered the enhancement of the sword spirit to the 4-season swordsmanship, the 10-strike swordsmanship would never be able to catch up with the 4-season swordsmanship. This was the qualitative change brought by the sword spirit to the flying swords. However, he was indeed very different from 7 years ago. 7 years ago, he was only a beginner in various skills. But now it was different. Because of his instinctive familiarity with the stars, his Big Dipper star scripture could now draw power from more than 50 stars. Moreover, the number of stars he could draw in every year was increasing rapidly. This also meant that his speed of absorbing the spiritual essence of heaven and earth was getting faster and faster. It had long surpassed the effect of using the spirit gathering array. This was the characteristic of the pure Taoist skills. As long as one was talented in this aspect, the later stage would be faster and faster. The swordsman was incomparably sharp, but in terms of cultivation speed, depth, and purity, it could never be compared with the orthodox Taoists. This was the real foundation of the Taoists. Therefore, no matter how strong Xinyuan was, it could never replace the position of the orthodox Taoists. In the past 10 years, his cultivation had successfully entered the middle stage of the foundation establishment stage. This was the credit of the orthodox Taoist skills. When one was suitable for it, the progress would be very fast, and there would be very few bottlenecks. The progress of his main cultivation technique was fast, and the other supplementary cultivation techniques were naturally not slow either. Just like his escape technique, starlight traction, no matter which direction he escaped in, there would be at least a dozen stars that he could borrow strength from. This made his escape technique more and more graceful, and also more and more strange. It was as if he was a marionette controlled by dozens of invisible strings, constantly changing. The purple microstar body was not a body cultivation technique that focused on strengthening a cultivator's body in certain aspects. Although it did provide earth-shaking changes to a cultivator's body, this sort of change was within the normal scope of a foundation establishment cultivator. There were many other body cultivation methods that could achieve this point and even surpass it in some aspects. Its greatest use to Lu Xiaoyi was that it provided a platform that was more suitable for the star system, allowing him to achieve twice the results with half the effort with the other star cultivation techniques. This was also what he valued the most. Needless to say, under the strong support of the Big Dipper scripture and the purple microstar body, Lu Xiaoyi's spiritual power had made great progress in the past 7 years. Although he did not have much contact with other cultivators, he was still unclear of the extent of his spiritual power. But in his opinion, if the white-robed swordsman were to follow him again, he should be able to easily find his position. He would no longer be at a loss and be at a loss as to what to do. To a cultivator, one's combat power was not something that could be improved by learning a certain sword technique or a certain special secret technique. It could only mean that one had more means to deal with special situations. The foundation of a cultivator's combat was always mana, spiritual power, escape technique, and body. In the future, when one's cultivation level increased, there might be Tao realm and so on. But to a foundation establishment cultivator, these 4 things were the most important. Then there was the swordsman's sharp teeth. Unfortunately, the current Lu Xiaoyi was only a tiger cub. His mouth was filled with only one tooth, 4 seasons. The Tendang flying sword's tooth had just grown out from his gums. It was a little loose and not sharp enough. It cannot be torn apart. Overall, Lu Xiaoyi was already very satisfied. In terms of the period of 10 to 20 years, one could only cultivate one flying sword. It was impossible to cultivate 10 layers of sword formations. Normally, one would choose 7 layers. Those who could cultivate 8 layers of sword formations were extraordinary geniuses. But even then, they would not be able to defeat his 5 layers of 4 seasons and sword spirit. He did not have many tricks up his sleeve, but at the same time, other people were not much stronger than him. This was also a fact. According to the rules of the external sword, a cultivator could choose 3 other techniques after every 10 years, regardless of the type. To Lu Xiaoyi, it was meaningless to choose another sword technique now. He could not even understand the sword formation of the 10-strike city, so he was afraid that the other techniques would not be any better. However, he liked the Cloud Turtle Tower very much. He liked the support technique. From his point of view, he already had a few offensive techniques: close combat, flying swords, and soul fighting techniques. Now, it was time for him to create a defensive technique. The Xianyuan swordsman focused on offense and not defense. However, Lu Xiaoyi did not think so. There was no harm in making his skin thicker. The ability to attack and withstand attacks were equally important. After cultivating for 10 years in Xianyuan, he was no longer the newbie he used to be. He walked into the sea of techniques with more confidence and calmness. Although he did not do it deliberately, his unique combat style had already been built up. The only thing he lacked now was some flesh and blood. After spending a few hours in the Cloud Turtle Tower, he realized that the defensive techniques of the swordsman mainly focused on a few aspects: substitution, damage reduction, displacement. This was in line with the fighting style of the swordsman. Because they were always moving at high speed, no matter if it was an internal sword or an external sword, the most effective way to defend was to use one's own speed to prevent the opponent from hitting. This was the first principle. Therefore, it was not recommended to use one's body to withstand attacks. This was because once the body was hit, it would immediately affect the attacking rhythm of the flying sword. This was unacceptable to the swordsman. Substitution was to use the sword puppet to withstand the damage. However, in the foundation building stage, the sword puppet could not withstand all the damage. Only in the later stages of Jindan or Yuaning would the sword puppet have the effect of substituting one's life. Other than the sword puppet, one could also use the puppet talisman or some other special equipment. However, they had a common problem. It was not easy to refine them. Furthermore, it required a long period of nurturing before it could fuse with the body. Once there was danger, it would automatically substitute for the body. Damage reduction, as the name suggested, was to withstand the damage. However, through some kind of secret technique, the damage would be reduced to a certain extent and the body would be able to withstand it. It was the path of exchanging damage for life. The damage reduction technique was a pure technique. It was best used when combined with a body cultivator's technique. It was very flexible. However, there was a disadvantage. The user's ability to withstand the opponent's ultimate move was limited. If the user made a wrong judgment, the damage would not be reduced, and the user would be sacrificed. Displacement was a technique to transfer the damage to a mysterious space. It was a very clever defensive technique. The user would be unharmed. However, the prerequisite was that the user had to have a different space. How could a mere foundation building stage cultivator find a portable space big enough to withstand the power of the opponent's technique? There was no need to even think about a storage ring. A microspace that could collapse with a fart was completely meaningless. Chapter 235. Lu Xiaoyi had set his sights on reducing damage, but there was nothing he could do about it. He didn't have a portable space, and that wasn't something that could be solved by relying on resources, but by chance. Puppets were troublesome to make, and they were limited in number. Every time he used them, there would be one less, and they couldn't deal with continuous attacks. Only damage reduction was possible. It might have the lowest defense against damage, but it could maintain damage reduction at any time and place. If it was combined with evading arts and body arts, it would indeed be an all-round form of self-protection. His philosophy was not to pursue the defensive ability of a single technique, but to focus more on the system. If his battle judgment, response, speed, body, and damage reduction couldn't prevent him from being hit, then it wouldn't be just because of the damage reduction technique, but because there was a problem with his battle tactics. There was one more thing. He saw a very familiar name in the damage reduction technique, together with the stars. This was a damage reduction technique based on the star system. The core was to let the stars that the cultivator could sense bear the damage together with him, thus achieving the goal of damage reduction. In Xuanyuan's external sword, there was basically no one who chose this kind of damage reduction technique, because its early damage reduction effect was far lower than other damage reduction techniques of the same level. For example, other damage reduction techniques had a damage reduction of 50%, but this one had a damage reduction of 30%. But the advantage of Together with the Stars was that it could continuously reduce damage. The advantage of other damage reduction techniques was that the starting point was high 50% damage reduction. As the cultivation level increased, the damage reduction effect could quickly reach 70% or 80%, and it could effectively protect the cultivator from being killed. But after reaching this level, it was basically hopeless to increase the damage. It could never be reduced to 90%, or even all of it. Together with the Stars had a damage reduction of 30%, and the improvement was slow. The improvement speed was completely dependent on the number and quality of stars that the cultivator could sense, but it could continue to improve. According to the hints in the technique, if the cultivator reached an unimaginable level one day, it could even provide a full damage reduction ability. In other words, even if the opponent had the ability to destroy the stars, when the attack fell on the cultivator, it would only be borne by the stars that he could sense. The prospect was very tempting, but there was no one to choose because no one could guarantee that they could reach that level. Not to mention the unimaginable realm. Even forming the Gene Dan would be worth burning incense. Only an idiot would make such a choice for a few hundred or thousand years of total reduction and then endure a few hundred or thousand years of low reduction. Lu Xiaoyi was no fool. The reason he made this choice was because of his inexplicable closeness and familiarity with the stars. He was confident that he could walk faster than others. That was all. His second choice was the sky-measuring sword ruler. It was difficult to define the offensive and defensive functions of the sky-measuring sword ruler. Its core principle was that when the flying sword was shot out for a certain distance, it would activate its swordsmanship and instantly become one with the sword, appearing at a point between the person and the flying sword. To put it simply, if the cultivator stood at midnight and shot the flying sword out to a distance of 1,000 feet to activate this skill, then the cultivator and the flying sword would appear at any point within the distance of 1,000 feet. Under normal circumstances, in the early stage of cultivation, the meeting point would be closer to the cultivator, which was between 0 and 50 feet. In a later stage, the meeting point would be closer to the flying sword, which was between 50 and 1,000 feet. It could be used as an escape method. In theory, as long as the flying sword was continuously shot out, the cultivator could constantly measure the distance. In terms of speed, the flying sword was much faster than the cultivator, but the disadvantage was that it consumed a lot of Dharma power. It needed constant practice to be proficient. It could also be used as a close-range skill, but it was relatively rare. In the foundation establishment stage, the cultivator could measure the position of the flying sword. Generally, the maximum distance was 60 to 70%. In other words, when the flying sword flew to a distance of 1,000 feet, the cultivator could activate his swordsmanship and measure at 60 to 70 feet. It was almost like teleportation. However, any further, the body and spirit of the foundation establishment stage could not bear the huge pulling force when the man and the sword became one. When a swordsman fought with his opponent, he would usually stay at the edge of the maximum attacking range of the flying sword. This was the characteristic of a swordsman. The closer he was to his opponent, the more powerful his swordsmanship would be. Therefore, a swordsman would not easily fight in a mid-range battle. They were in the optimal state of distance, between the farthest distance and the closest distance. Such a battle habit was awkward for the sky-measuring sword ruler. If you fought with your opponent at a distance of 2,000 feet and used the sky-measuring sword ruler, the distance would be shortened to 800 feet. You would not be able to reach your opponent with your sword, and the flying sword would be awkward. However, this was not the main reason why it was not popular. The main reason was that every time a foundation establishment cultivator became one with the sword, they often had to spend a few breaths of time to recover from the dizziness due to their awkward spiritual power cultivation. This was very fatal for a cultivator in battle. If the opponent was alert enough, these few breaths of time would be enough to take your life. Therefore, although the sky-measuring sword ruler could be used in the foundation establishment stage, no one dared to use it. Only in the gene dance stage, when the cultivator's spirit and spirit were substantially improved, could they control the loss of consciousness after teleportation within a few seconds. Only then did the sky-measuring sword ruler become useful in battle. However, a gene dance swordsman had countless other choices and might not necessarily choose the sky-measuring sword ruler. Therefore, the sky-measuring sword ruler was a very unique swordsmanship that was suitable for both escape and close combat, but very few people were interested in it. However, these fatal weaknesses did not exist for Lu Xiaoyi. The range of his flying sword was extremely long because of the existence of the sword spirit. When he confronted his opponent at a distance of 2,000 feet, he could completely release his flying sword to a distance of 3,000 feet and then suddenly close the distance. Because of his strong spiritual power, his loss of consciousness and dizziness would be much shorter than that of ordinary people. If he practiced more, it could be a very practical swordsmanship. In fact, there was a swordsmanship with the same nature in the inner sword, called shadow sword attachment, which had the same effect. Unfortunately, it required the cooperation of the sword pill. Lu Xiaoyi did not have a sword pill, only the four seasons. It was not known whether the cooperation between him and the sword spirit of the four seasons could achieve a satisfactory result. The secret swordsmanship Lu Xiaoyi chose was mostly unpopular. This was not surprising, because he had a relatively unique concept of swordsmanship and a relatively unique experience of drifting in the universe. When he chose the Big Dipper scripture, which was very popular in the Orthodox Taoist sect, but was very rare in the sword vein, it meant that his next choice would be different. The Big Dipper scripture was not suitable for a swordsman because they did not have the mentality of a Taoist cultivator to explore the secrets of the starry sky. This kind of swordsmanship, at least in the early stage of cultivation, was not suitable for a swordsman who paid attention to explosive power. This was a difference in direction and was very difficult to coordinate. Chapter 236. Lu Xiaoyi chose to reserve the last spot. His current knowledge was still somewhat lacking, and he needed to constantly interact with people to slowly discover his own shortcomings. Only then would he be able to find a way to deal with them. There were still 10 years before he could obtain a new quota. It was still too early. He also didn't ask when the competition between the inner and outer swords would begin. It seemed like this matter wasn't fixed in Xinyuan either. For a cultivator, the most important thing was to have one's own rhythm. One couldn't sharpen one's spear at the last minute just because the competition was about to begin. This wasn't in line with the rules of cultivation. Right now, he didn't have anywhere to go. The only people he was familiar with, cigarette box and ashtray, had also gone out on a mission together. When he first left, they had even asked him about his intentions. Now, in such a large dome, there wasn't even a single person to talk to. 3 months later, a sword order came from the Ascension Hall, requesting him to gather. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. This was an involuntary cultivation. When he arrived at the Ascension Hall, under the guidance of a senior brother, he walked to the highest point of the Thousand Virtues Peak. Sword Chi rushed to the Soaring Heaven Pavilion. This was the core of the outer swords, and all the affairs of the sect from the Yuanying and below were handled here. In the dome, there was another sect with the same function, the Chaotic Thunder Palace. Although the Thunder Palace was more powerful, in terms of the number of cultivators under their jurisdiction, the Soaring Heaven Pavilion was more than 10 streets ahead of the Thunder Palace. Foundation establishment cultivators weren't directly managed by the Soaring Heaven Pavilion. Instead, they were assigned to a branch of the Ascension Hall. However, in this competition with the inner swords, the Ascension Hall didn't have the qualifications to interfere. Instead, it was directly arranged by the outer swordsmen of the Soaring Heaven Pavilion. In terms of status, don't look at the position of the Ascension Hall's palace master. In reality, his position in the sect might not even be as high as that of the Soaring Heaven Pavilion's deacon. The reason was simple. The Ascension Hall only dealt with the various Foundation establishment chores in the dome. Its palace master and vice palace master were mostly old and incompetent people. What mattered was loyalty and ability. On the other hand, The cultivators of the Soaring Heaven Pavilion had to deal with the outside world all year round. In terms of ability, combat strength was often the most important. They were not allowed to enter through the main entrance. This was what that senior martial brother had told them over and over again. Only cultivators of the Jindan realm and above were allowed to enter through the main entrance. This was not discrimination, but rather the fact that there were tens of thousands of cultivators who had reached the Foundation establishment realm. If there were no rules, sooner or later, the threshold of the Soaring Heaven Pavilion would be ground down. It was a side door behind the Sword Chi Rushing Heaven Pavilion's enormous building complex. On the door, there were two intersecting swords. The symbol was so clear that he was not afraid that he would not be able to find it. The door was closed. Maybe it was because Lu Xiaoyi was the last to arrive, or maybe he was too slow, so he was the last to arrive. Pushing open the door and entering was obviously impolite, and probing with divine sense was just asking for trouble in the sky-rising tower that was filled with crouching tigers and hidden dragons. So, he obediently knocked on the door. The door opened. There was no one in sight, only a faint voice. Sword Chi Soaring Heaven Pavilion is an important place. Unauthorized people are not allowed to enter. Whose disciple are you? Which cave residence? What brings you here? Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. With his cultivation, age, time, and place, what else could he possibly be here for? He said he was here to look for Little Miss. Could he? This disciple is Cigarette, but I was summoned by Meng Denglin Hall to gather here. I don't know the details. A divine sense swept over him. You're the first person to come to Thousand Elegance Peaks, Sky Rising Tower, to use Taoist escape techniques instead of flying on swords. With the characteristics of your escape technique, you don't have the valiant bearing and imposing manner of a swordsman, yet you still dare to participate in the internal and external sword competition. I'm afraid you're just someone who doesn't dare to leave the mountain and is relying on this to get by, right? Lu Xiaoyi thought, "You're really smart." He respectfully asked, "May I know which martial uncle senior is?" In the Xianyuan sword faction, swordsmen had to answer each other's questions out of courtesy, regardless of seniority. So, although the voice was somewhat unwilling, it still snorted. "Gu Huang." Lu Xiaoyi immediately answered, "It's hard to explain why I'm here. It's not entirely voluntary. If martial uncle Gu Huang thinks I'm not qualified, I'll just go back." He turned around and was about to leave when he was suddenly stopped by an inexplicable force. "Stop. You want to push the blame to me? You want to go back and enjoy yourself? I've eaten more salt than you've eaten rice, and the bridges I've crossed are longer than the roads you've walked. You want to show off your cleverness here? Go in obediently. If you dare to have any thoughts, I'll beat you up." Lu Xiaoyi laughed dryly as he walked in. He thought, "Couldn't you have made way earlier? Why did you talk so much nonsense, making it seem like I was being nosy?" There weren't many twists and turns inside. There were two forks on the left and right, each leading to a side hall. He heard voices on the left, so he walked in. There were dozens of Foundation establishment cultivators standing solemnly inside. He hurriedly walked to the back and quietly stood there, his heart trembling. Xianyuan sword faction was truly filled with hidden dragons and crouching tigers. He didn't even need to use his divine sense to feel that the cultivators around him had deep cultivations and surging magic power. None of them were inferior to him. As expected, he had always mingled in the outer cultivator circle and had never come into contact with the local and old sections. Now, it seemed that they were truly formidable. They stood out one by one, full of energy and imposing manner. He really couldn't compare to them. He immediately clamped his tail between his legs again. It seemed that his strategy was correct. When he went out 7 years ago, he encountered a few soft persimmons, which was why he was able to kill 4 people in a row. If he encountered cultivators of this level, how could he kill 4 people in a row? A Gene Dan above was calling out names according to the roster. He couldn't be blamed for using such a primitive method. There were simply too many external Sword Foundation establishment cultivators. There were tens of thousands of them, and it was impossible to recognize all of them. Moreover, Jean Dan didn't come into contact with them all the time in the Ascension Hall. Instead, he spent most of his time in the core sword aura rushing to the Heavens Pavilion. How could he have the opportunity to come into contact with these low-level foundation establishment cultivators? The roll call was quick and without hesitation until a voice shouted, "Cigarette butt." Two voices answered at the same time. They were Lu Xiaoyi and another female cultivator. Dozens of pairs of eyes immediately swept over. Lu Xiaoyi remained calm. Was this woman crazy? How could she joke in this kind of situation? However, the female cultivator's face was filled with anger. Her phoenix-like eyes widened as she glared fiercely at the last person to come in and cause trouble. She had a peerlessly beautiful face and a bit of an icy fairy. She was famous among the domed foundation establishment female swordsmen. Hailing from her hometown, the Azure Sky Great World, she usually had many suitors. However, she focused on cultivation and never paid any attention to them. Who knew that this guy would openly flirt in such a serious situation to show that he stood out from the crowd? He was courting death. However, no one moved or even uttered a word. This was because Martial Uncle Jean Dan was here. The host, Jean Dan, frowned. In truth, he wasn't too sure either. He was usually busy running around outside and had only returned for a few years. How could he know these little fellows? Carefully examining the jade slip in his hand, he saw that it was clearly written on it, "Smoker, female, entered the sect for 30 years. Hails from the Azure Sky Great World's northern region." Thus, his eyes narrowed as he stared at the troublemaker. "Who are you? Why are you here to cause trouble? If you don't tell me the truth, I'm afraid you won't be able to leave the rushing to the Heavens Pavilion today." Chapter 237. Lu Xiaoyi was somewhat flustered. No matter how thick-skinned he was, with so many pairs of eyes staring at him, and Jean Dan and Swordsman's extremely invasive gaze, he knew that now was not the time for jokes and nonsense. He hurriedly explained, "Disciple Cigarette, but I've received orders from the Ascension Hall to participate in the confrontation between the inner and outer swords at Soaring Heaven Pavilion. Martial Uncle said that I'm causing trouble. Why do you think so?" Jean Dan only needed to use his divine sense to roughly estimate his age. Thinking about the side hall next to him, he understood. At the same time, he used his divine sense to send a message to his junior martial brother near the side hall. "Junior martial brother Gucci, is there a disciple called Cigarette, but in your name list?" Junior martial brother Gucci was very surprised. "There is. Moreover, this brat dared to disobey orders and delay coming. I'll have the Ascension Hall bring him here later and punish him properly." Senior Martial Brother Yun Xiao. Senior Martial Brother Yun Xiao laughed. "No need to punish him. This brat came to me in a daze and even answered my call." Senior Martial Brother Yun Xiao had finished communicating with his junior martial brother and did not say much. "Cigarette, but right? What I said just now was you Chua, not the head, not the butt of the cigarette, do you understand? You've only been in the sect for 10 years. You should go to the younger group next door, not here." The dozens of cultivators all had smiles in their eyes. Was he getting fierce? He still hadn't recovered from his shock? Lu Xiaoyi completely understood. He had worked so hard and felt that his cultivation had increased rapidly. Even if he couldn't take the top spot, he couldn't be at the bottom, right? So this was the level of foundation establishment for 20 to 50 years. Looking at it this way, it was normal for his cultivation to be inferior to others. His star system cultivation method would become stronger in the future, but it hadn't completely revealed itself yet. It was really embarrassing, but thick-skinned people naturally had their own methods. If he covered his face and left now, he would really lose face. If he could use something to cover it up, thus, he clasped his hands towards Jean Dan and said, "Disciple Meng Rong, this is my first time here and I'm not familiar with the terrain. My knowledge is limited and I'm in a hurry. I'm sorry to have disturbed Martial Uncle." Yin Xiao nodded. Although this person was a little muddle-headed, these small cultivators were indeed unfamiliar with many of Xuanyuan's internal rules. Moreover, they had limited friends, so mistakes like this were excusable. There was no need to fuss over minor matters. Xuanyuan's power and influence did not need to be used on these meaningless family members. Lu Xiaoyi turned to the crowd and bowed deeply. Sorry for the delay. Finally, he turned to the female cultivator who had the same name as him. Senior apprentice Sister Kuang, it's not my fault for having the same name, but I sincerely apologize for offending you today. When I have the chance, I'll definitely treat you to a meal. If senior sister doesn't like my Dharma name, you can ask the sect to change it for me. I don't mind. Lu Xiaoyi swaggered off. Yin Xiao was very satisfied with this attitude of his. He was not afraid of making a mistake, but he was afraid of losing his mind after making a mistake. Swordsman needed a kind of indifferent attitude. Lu Xiaoyi finally made the right choice this time. What he did not expect was that everyone in the side hall was waiting for him, all of them looking like they were waiting to see a joke. Once again, the awkwardness arose. The host, Jean Dan, said, I've heard that swordsmanship can be practiced by skipping grades, but I've never heard that age can be skipped. Cigarette, butt, right? Actually, in Xuanyuan's external swordsmanship, high-level cultivators cannot challenge lower-level cultivators, but low-level cultivators can challenge higher-level cultivators. If you're really so confident in yourself, I can actually arrange for you to be with senior apprentice brother Yin Xiao. Lu Xiaoyi bowed again. I'm very sorry for wasting everyone's time, but this is the first time I've come to Soaring Sky Hall, so I'm very unfamiliar with it. When I entered, I was scolded by Marshal Uncle Gu Huang at the door, so I'm a bit confused, so? Gucci was just joking, but he did not expect this guy to directly push the blame to Gu Huang. He was also a slippery person. Now that everyone was here, the roll call was over, and they could begin. This time, the internal and external swordsmanship competition will be divided into two levels. The first level is the elementary level cultivators who have been building their foundation for 10 to 20 years, which is mine. The second level is the intermediate level cultivators who have been building their foundation for 20 to 50 years, which is senior apprentice brother Yin Xiao next door. Above that level, cultivators have already been fixed in all aspects, whether it's cultivation methods or sword skills. They have experience, many friends, and a wide range of knowledge. So there's no point in competing. Only you have the possibility of changing. Looking at the crowd, he said, the 23 people who came today are all the best among your peers. At least, that's what you think. Whether or not it's true, we'll have to see your performance in the sparring match. It's good to have confidence. It's the foundation of a swordsman. But because of history, we have never won against the internal swordsman. This is a fact, and we admit it. But it doesn't mean that we'll be willing to be like this forever. The fact that you're standing here is proof of this. At the very least, you have more courage than others to face failure. I'm proud of you. These were repetitive words. Those who went outside still had to face the danger of death. Don't think that the sect is deliberately making things difficult for you. I'll tell you the truth, in the previous competitions, the internal and external swordsman competitions have always been one-sided. The internal swordsman likes to ignore them, but we, the external swordsmen, chase after them. Why? Swordsmen can only truly grow through continuous failure, setbacks, and even death. They have to face all kinds of enemies above the fifth ring in the universe and finally grow. Which one of them was born in a cave? At the very least, you won't die in a challenge against the internal swordsman. But other than death, we won't stop any danger, even harm. Our goal is to let you understand your own shortcomings in the competition, to reconsider your direction, and to plan your own system. Because you've only been cultivating for a short time, there's still time to change everything. Like those who have built their foundation 50 years ago, how can they have the time to change? Any system must be tested through actual combat. Now, it's the internal swordsman, and in the future, it'll be the other orthodoxies of the fifth ring. This isn't something you could decide on a whim. You have to understand the sect's painstaking efforts. This is all for your growth. Then, you still have a chance to withdraw. If you say it now, I won't blame you. How could this be? Among the cultivators present, Most of them were from the Fifth Ring's main domain and their hometown, Qingkong. They were all die-hard swordsman members, and no one was more determined than them in terms of wisdom. Was it okay to withdraw now? It was just a well-intentioned lie, and, at the very least, they would be kicked out of the mission. They might even be labeled as cowards and be abandoned by the sect. They couldn't listen to such words. Lu Xiaoyi was still wondering why this was as tragic as a suicide squad. Was there a need to compete with fellow sect members? He didn't expect to be called out by Gu Qi in the next moment. Cigarette, but are you withdrawing? Chapter 238. Lu Xiaoyi's heart was filled with hatred. What had he done? Why was everyone targeting him? Gu Huang was like this when he entered, Yin Xiao was like this, and now Gu Qi was like this too. Did they think he was easy to bully and treated him as a negative example? He could only blame himself for being careless and walking into the wrong door. But he couldn't say anything now. This disciple came the latest, but that doesn't mean I'll be the first to leave. Martial uncle, don't worry. Gu Qi nodded with satisfaction. He wasn't targeting the cigarette, but since he was late, no matter what the reason was, it shouldn't be a problem to use words to beat him, right? Being late was also a problem, and he couldn't be spoiled. 23 people. You will enter Xuanyuan's famous Nine Palaces realm along with 31 of your seniors. Your opponents will only be 19 inner swordsmen. Among them, there are 10 inner swordsmen from 10 to 20 years old and 9 from 20 to 50 years old. It's not that they're unequal, but they really can't gather the same number of people. The Nine-Spirit Ancestor of the Nine-Palace realm will arrange your battles according to your entry years. In other words, the only opponents for the 23 of you will be the 10 inner sword cultivators who have been in the Foundation establishment for less than 20 years. This is completely random, and everything will be arranged by Jiu Lingjun. 10 of you are destined to meet the inner swordsman, and the other 13 will also fight against each other in pairs. There's no need to worry. You can do whatever you want. You can use any method, any trump card. Only by killing each other will you be able to truly train yourselves. A cultivator asked, Kill each other? Don't you need to hold back? What if you injure the inner swordsman or our outer swordsman? Will we be punished by the sect? Gu Qi snorted. Do you know who Jiu Lingjun is? He's an existence that has lived longer than Xuanyuan's history. Do you know how high his realm is? Although I don't know, in Xuanyuan's sword sect, even a perfected ancestor has to be respectful to him. It's your fortune to be able to train in the Nine Palaces realm. In another space, with human cultivators controlling the battle, there will be some restrictions, and you won't be able to display your full strength. Only in this place, even if you completely let go, Jiu Lingjun will still pull you out at the last moment. Not to mention just a few dozen of you. Even if a few hundred people went in, there would not be a single accident in tens of thousands of years. This was the best opportunity for actual combat training, and only a very small number of people could enjoy it. It happens once every few decades. Do you think it's a common occurrence? When you grow up, you will know that a lot of old Foundation establishment cultivators, including Jean Dan, can't enter the world of Nine Palaces to practice battle. However, the sect has given all of this to you newbies without any reservations. Think carefully about the expectations you have. Another voice said weakly, Could it be that we're mixed up with those swordsmen who have more than 20 years of experience? Gu Qi glared at him coldly. That cultivator felt that his question was too childish. He could even control the life and death of every battle. How could this incredible ancestor Jiuling make such a mistake? Thus, he lowered his head and didn't dare to say anything. Gu Qi continued, In principle, each of you will encounter a few inner swordsmen. The more you encounter, the more battles you will have, and the greater the help you will have. However, if you have a mental breakdown, Jiu Lingjun will send you out of the world of Nine Palaces until your willpower reaches its limit. The judgment will be made by Yuaning, Martial Uncle, and Jiu Lingjun. It will not only be based on victory and defeat, but also on other things, such as willpower, tactics, unyielding spirit, and so on. This will be the final judgment, and you will not be wronged. The rules were more or less clear. In a word, once you entered, you would be killed. Anyway, Ancestor Jiulingjun was there to back them up. However, what kind of place was the world of 9 palaces? Everyone was confused. Was it a space with countless arenas? Or was everyone mixed together? No one asked in detail. Once they entered, they would naturally understand. It was useless to say more. Since everyone understood, Gu Qi led 23 people out. Immediately after, Yin Xiao led 31 senior brothers and appeared in front of them, including the female cultivator called Yin Shun. Lu Xiaoyi greeted them from afar, but they didn't even look at him. Lu Xiaoyi was a very sunny young man and was a little handsome. However, in the swordsman community, super handsome cultivators were all sought after. His appearance didn't have any advantage at all. Moreover, cultivators valued strength above all, especially in the sword vein. Even if you looked like a ghost, as long as you were strong enough, you would still be pursued by a large number of people. Yin Xiao and Gu Qi took the lead and flew. The cultivators behind them followed one after another. Without exception, they all used the sword control technique. Lu Xiaoyi wasn't familiar with the sword control technique. He also rarely practiced it, so it wasn't obvious during normal times. However, when it came to group activities like this, when dozens of people were using the sword control technique, it would be ridiculous if you used the celestial escape technique. Therefore, he could only use the sword control technique. He wasn't the kind of person who had to be a maverick. He knew the benefits of following the crowd. Unfortunately, the sword control technique wasn't good enough. Yin Xiao and Gu Qi had already suppressed their speed to a very low level, fully considering the limitations of a 10-year foundation establishment cultivator's ability. However, even with such a basic sword control technique, that cigarette was having a hard time keeping up. It made people speechless. The entire group of sword control techniques was divided into 3 groups. The 2 Jindan leaders, the large group of swordsmen in the middle formed a neat and orderly formation, and then the last group far behind. Yin Xiao and Gu Qi didn't say anything. In fact, they were quite critical of the way the outer sword sect was chosen. It was too casual and too perfunctory. In their opinion, this kind of rare opportunity should have been selected from the outer sword sect in advance, leaving the opportunity for the most outstanding disciples. It shouldn't have been purely voluntary like this, and then a few strange things had sneaked in. In history, there had been many outer swordsmen who had mentioned this to the sect's higher-ups, but they had never received a reply. When they occasionally communicated with their own teachers, they would ask about the reason. There were only a few reasons. A large-scale selection could easily cause disharmony within the outer sword sect. Moreover, some swordsmen didn't wish to grow in the competition with the inner sword sect. They were more willing to go out and meet the elites of other orthodoxies. The most important thing was that when high-level cultivators considered problems, they would often mix in some things related to fate. In their words, sometimes the strange things that were mixed in might not necessarily not become pillars in the future. They had to leave some leeway for the will of the heavens. Only then would there be changes and miracles. Therefore, they could only endure. Endure a 10-year foundation establishment idiot who didn't even know how to use the sword control technique. Finally, they arrived at a gentle slope at the foot of Wenguang Peak. Here, a huge wild beast's head was facing the sky. An inner sword Yuanying had already led 19 inner sword disciples to wait solemnly. On these inner sword disciples, there wasn't any killing intent like the outer sword sect disciples. Instead, they stood in an ordinary and relaxed manner, revealing a disregard that made the outer swordsmen feel ashamed. This was a psychological advantage that had been settled down for tens of thousands of years. Yin Xiao and Gu Qi came forward and respectfully bowed to the inner sword Yuanying. That Yuanying waved his hand. "You're all here? Then let's begin. There's no need for those complicated formalities. Let's fight early and leave early." Ancestor Jiuling is the one who can't stand procrastination. Yin Xiao was very embarrassed. "Martial uncle, wait. There's still one behind us." Hearing this, the inner swordsman looked towards the horizon. A sword light gathered its strength and flew awkwardly towards them. The sword control technique wasn't coherent. It was intermittent, as if it was cramping all of the inner swordsman's side. Competing with the outer swordsman was becoming more and more boring. It was so boring that even this kind of trash dared to come here to fill the numbers. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.